Welcome back to Boring Dreamy Historian, the place where we wander slowly through the forgotten corners of the past, one quiet story at a time. Tonight, we're tracing the gentle footsteps of Mansa Musa, the Emperor of Gold, a man whose life shimmered softly against the desert sands. Before we begin, take a moment to subscribe if you enjoy these calming journeys into history. And I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from right now, and what time is it for you? It's always fascinating to see how these sleepy histories reach across time zones and corners of the world. Now settle in, dim the lights, and let's begin. If you close your eyes for a moment and let your thoughts drift back to the 14th century, you find yourself standing in a part of the world that rarely makes its way into bedtime stories. The Sahara stretches endlessly, its dunes rising and falling like frozen waves, the heat during the day baking the ground until it cracks, and the cold at night seeping into the bones of anyone who dares to rest uncovered. To the west of this desert lies a kingdom whose wealth is almost impossible to measure. This is Mali, the empire that would, under one man's steady hand, become the stuff of legend. His name was Musa, but history remembers him more formally Mansa Musa, the Emperor of Gold. You might imagine that wealth of this kind was loud and glittering, the way we often see it in films. Coins spilling out of chests, palaces dripping with gemstones, kings parading in endless robes of silk. Yet the story of Mansa Musa's life begins in a way far quieter and much slower. For much of his youth, there was no certainty that he would ever rule. He was born into the Keita dynasty, a line of rulers who traced their heritage back to the founder of Mali, the great Sundiata Keita. This family line was vast, with many brothers, cousins, and nephews, all with claims of their own. To be born into it was both a privilege and a burden. Musa was educated, of course, but he spent much of his early life watching, waiting, and listening, three skills that would later shape his reign. Daily life in Mali during Musa's youth was, in many ways, unremarkable to those who lived it. Villagers rose with the sun, their work bound to the cycles of farming trade and the rhythm of the seasons. The Niger River was the lifeline of the empire, its waters not just quenching thirst but feeding rice paddies, carrying fishermen out in narrow wooden boats, and providing routes for traders who bound the empire together. Gold dust was exchanged in markets, carried in little leather pouches, so common in some towns that it was treated almost like small change. And yet, for all its abundance, gold itself had less immediate value than salt, which kept meat from rotting and preserved health in the crushing heat. It was in this balance of the ordinary and the extraordinary that Musa grew. The Mali Empire in Musa's time was already powerful, but its wealth was largely invisible to the outside world. To the Europeans, far away across deserts and seas, Africa was a distant land of mystery. Maps barely captured its outline, filling empty spaces with dragons or blank parchment. To Muslim merchants, however, Mali was already a familiar land, tied into the great web of trans-Saharan trade. Camel caravans trudged slowly across the dunes, their bells jingling softly in the dry wind. They carried salt from the mines of Tagaza, gold from the riverbeds of Bambouk, ivory, kola nuts, and even enslaved people, a painful reminder of how prosperity has so often been entwined with suffering. It is said that Musa was not destined to rule, but was appointed deputy when his predecessor, Mansa Abu Bakr II, supposedly set out on a mysterious expedition across the Atlantic Ocean. Whether Abu Bakr truly attempted to cross to unknown lands, or whether the story is more legend than fact, we cannot say with certainty. But it left Musa as regent, and when Abu Bakr did not return, Musa became emperor. Imagine the sudden shift: one day a deputy, expected to maintain order until the true ruler's return, and the next, a man crowned Mansa, responsible for one of the richest empires on earth. Rulership in Mali was not simply about wealth. A Mansa was expected to be both a guardian of tradition and a servant of Islam. Musa, like many rulers of his time, balanced these roles carefully. He was deeply committed to Islam, shaping much of his reign around its practices, but he also understood that Mali's power came from respecting the customs and rhythms of its people. This was not an empire of quick decisions. It was a land where authority was layered. Village elders, chiefs, generals, and advisors all wove together the fabric of rule. Musa's gift was his ability to move calmly among them, listening more than he spoke, and acting slowly but firmly when it was time. Perhaps the most famous chapter of Musa's reign, the one that would carry his name into legends across continents, was his pilgrimage to Mecca, the Hajj. But before we get there, it is worth pausing in his early years of power. For this is where the foundation of his empire was truly set. Musa inherited a system of taxation that stretched from farmers in tiny villages to traders crossing vast deserts. He expanded it gently, strengthening the empire's borders not with sudden conquest but with a steady hand. He appointed governors, called farbus, to oversee distant provinces. These men were chosen carefully, expected to maintain peace and ensure that taxes and tribute flowed back to the capital. In return, Musa guaranteed them stability, using both the empire's military and its wealth to hold the fabric of Mali together. Life at the court in Niani, the capital, would have seemed both impressive and oddly routine to a visitor. Musa himself, by all accounts, was not a flamboyant man. He did not parade his wealth in golden armor or jeweled crowns. Instead, his court reflected a quiet power. Scholars were welcomed, scribes copied texts, merchants arrived and departed with goods and stories. The city itself was built not of marble or stone, but of sun, dried brick and wood, practical materials for the climate. Fires smoked in courtyards, clay jars held grain and water, and musicians played the kora, its harp, like notes weaving gently through the air in the evenings. If you had walked through Niani at dusk, you might not have recognized it as the capital of the richest empire of its age. It was a place where the extraordinary and the ordinary existed side by side, as natural as breathing. But wealth, even quiet wealth, attracts attention. Stories of Mali's gold began to spread outward. Merchants who carried salt north returned with tales of cities where gold dust was so plentiful it was traded in handfuls. The rulers of North Africa and Egypt heard whispers of a Mansa whose coffers overflowed. To them, Musa was still only a distant name, untested on the world stage, and Musa himself, still early in his reign, had yet to leave the mark that would make his name unforgettable. In these early years, Musa focused on learning, building, and preparing. He ensured that his empire's borders were secure, its trade routes steady, and its people cared for. He encouraged Islam, commissioning mosques in towns where none had stood before, and inviting scholars to his court to teach. At the same time, he remained careful not to disrupt the traditions of Mali's people, allowing the rhythm of farming, fishing, and market life to continue largely as it always had. It was this balance, between faith and tradition, between power and patience, that allowed Musa to rule with such stability. Yet even as his empire thrived quietly, Musa must have known that his place in history would not be secured by silence. The pilgrimage to Mecca, a duty of every Muslim who could afford it, was more than a religious obligation. For a ruler like Musa, it was a chance to step onto the world stage, to show his devotion to Islam, and perhaps unintentionally, to reveal to the wider world the vast wealth of Mali. And so, in the year 1324, Musa began to plan his journey. But how does a man who rules over endless wealth travel? Does he slip away quietly, with a few trusted companions, seeking only prayer and reflection? Or does he move with the full weight of his empire, letting the world see, perhaps for the first time, the scale of Mali's riches? This question, of how Musa would present himself to the world beyond Mali, was the turning point of his reign. For while his early years were marked by quiet stability, the pilgrimage would thrust him into a spotlight so bright that his name would echo across continents for centuries. But before we follow Musa across the desert, before we imagine the endless caravan of servants, camels, and treasure that would astonish the world, it is worth pausing here. What did it mean for Musa himself to take this journey? Was it faith alone that drove him? Or did he sense, even then, that Mali's quiet wealth was about to become a story so extraordinary that it could never again be hidden? If the first part of Mansa Musa's life was shaped quietly by inheritance and the rhythms of Mali's desert trade, the second part unfolded under the full weight of responsibility. You might picture him seated in a simple palace built of packed earth and sun-dried brick, the walls softened by the desert winds, his court filled not with the clamor of armies, but with the shuffle of scribes, the whispers of traders, and the steady recitation of prayers. It was not an empire of marble and iron but of dust, salt, and gold, materials as fragile and enduring as time itself. As emperor, Musa's first task was not to dazzle the world, but to maintain the balance of an already vast realm. Mali's empire stretched far beyond the river Niger, across savanna and desert, into villages where people lived on millet and goat's milk, and into towns whose markets hummed with the smell of dried fish and the rustle of cloth dyed indigo. Each region had its own rhythm, and it fell upon Musa to let those rhythms continue without too much interference. Rule, for him, was as much about patience as command. The wealth of Mali rested on two seemingly simple things, salt and gold. You may imagine salt today as something ordinary, poured carelessly into soup, forgotten on a table. But in Musa's Mali, salt was life itself. It preserved food, allowed caravans to travel without spoilage, and restored strength in the heat of the desert. Without salt, no empire could survive. From the mines of Tagaza, blocks of salt were cut like stone, stacked onto the backs of camels, and carried across endless dunes. Each block was heavy, crystalline, almost luminous in the sun. And when they reached the markets of Mali, they were treated with reverence, traded ounce for ounce, sometimes even weighed against gold. Gold, on the other hand, was Mali's secret treasure. The empire produced more of it than nearly anywhere else on earth in that age, so much so that Mansa Musa himself had to be careful not to flood the markets of the Mediterranean with it. Gold gleamed in the ornaments of kings, in the threads woven into cloth, and in the dust that clung to the hands of miners along the riverbeds. But for the common people of Mali, gold was less important than the grain in their baskets, the salt on their tongues, or the shade of a baobab tree in the dry season. Musa, in his role, had to think of both perspectives: the magnificence of empire and the quiet survival of the villages. He was remembered for his piety, and perhaps that too was a way of balance. In the mornings, he prayed in the mosque at his capital of Niani, the sound of his recitation rising with the hum of crickets, and the first calls of traders in the markets. In the evenings, he walked among his courtiers not with thunderous declarations, but with the deliberate, measured tone of one who believed his power was granted by God and guided by duty. His court was filled with scholars and judges, men who had traveled from across the Islamic world to serve in Mali. Some came from the great libraries of Timbuktu, others from far-off places like Cairo or Andalusia. They brought with them books bound in leather, the words of philosophers and jurists, the wisdom of centuries carefully copied by hand. Musa was not known for extravagance in these early years. Instead, he was known for building, for laying foundations. It was under his patronage that mosques were raised in the desert towns, and that Timbuktu began to grow from a market town into a beacon of learning. Life for the ordinary people under Musa's reign followed slower rhythms. Imagine a farmer in a small village along the Niger River. He woke with the dawn, tethered his goat, and stepped barefoot into the wet soil of his fields. Millet grew in clusters, tall and bending under the weight of seed. Women pounded grain with heavy wooden pestles, the sound rhythmic, like a heartbeat of the village. Children carried water from clay pots, their laughter carrying lightly in the air. Traders sometimes passed through, bringing salt, cloth, or copper, and in return, the villagers offered hides, fish, or a few precious nuggets of gold. This quiet daily life rarely reached the ears of kings, but it was the foundation upon which Musa's empire stood. At times, the empire was threatened. Nomadic tribes pushed at its borders, hungry for the wealth of Mali. To protect his people, Musa relied not on constant war, but on careful alliances. Caravans carried not only goods but also messages, and in their long journeys across the Sahara, friendships were forged, treaties spoken, and rivalries softened by trade. It is telling that Mali grew so vast not by endless battles, but by the slow weaving of economic and cultural ties. Still, Musa was not a figure content to remain hidden forever in the folds of West Africa. His piety demanded something more. Islam prescribed the pilgrimage to Mecca, the Hajj, as one of the 5 pillars of faith. And for Mansa Musa, this was not simply a personal obligation. It was a statement of Mali's place in the wider world. It was as if the desert itself was calling him outward, urging him to step from the silence of his palace into the wider stage of history. But what did it mean truly for an emperor to prepare for such a journey? It meant gathering thousands of people, courtiers, soldiers, scholars, servants, and leading them across the vast Sahara. It meant organizing supplies of water, food, and of course salt. It meant camels laden with cloth, ivory, and gold dust. And it meant that the quiet rhythms of Mali would soon echo in Cairo, Medina, and Mecca. This decision to embark on pilgrimage was not only a religious act, but a political one. To show the wealth of Mali was to declare its presence in a world that often looked elsewhere, toward Europe, Arabia, or Asia. For centuries, West Africa had been seen by outsiders as a distant, shadowed place at the edge of the known world. Musa's pilgrimage would change that perception forever. And so, you may picture him in the final days before departure, seated in his palace of Niani, the lamps burning low, scribes writing lists of supplies, caravan leaders calculating routes. Outside, the villagers of Mali continued their ordinary lives, preparing grain, leading goats to pasture, or gathering firewood. None could fully imagine what it would mean when their emperor stepped beyond the horizon and carried the name of Mali into the heart of the Islamic world. The question remained, however, how far would his generosity and his wealth extend once he reached foreign lands? Would the desert caravans hold steady under the burden of such opulence? Would the emperor's faith be remembered more than his gold, or his gold more than his faith? When the great caravan of Mansa Musa finally set forth across the Sahara, it must have looked less like a royal entourage and more like a wandering city. Imagine a line of camels stretching endlessly across the dunes, each loaded with bundles of salt, sacks of grain, and, most importantly, heavy leather pouches filled with gold dust. There were soldiers with spears polished dull in the sun, scholars carrying precious books wrapped in cloth, women preparing food over small fires in the evenings, and musicians whose quiet rhythms echoed softly against the desert's silence. The emperor himself was not carried in splendid litters of silk, as some later storytellers might exaggerate, but in a manner suited to the time and place, shaded by cloth, guarded by loyal attendants, and surrounded always by the air of gravity that a ruler carried even when traveling. His footsteps, like those of his people, pressed briefly into the sand, only to be swept away again by the desert wind. For weeks, perhaps months, the caravan pressed eastward. Day after day, the sun rose without mercy, a pale disk in a sky emptied of clouds. Salt was consumed, water was rationed, and still the camels trudged on. It was a pilgrimage in the truest sense, a test of endurance, patience, and faith. When the caravan at last reached Cairo in 1324, the city stirred with whispers. Who was this ruler from beyond the desert, whose entourage numbered in the thousands? Who was this Musa, carrying wealth as casually as one carried bread? Cairo, a city already accustomed to grandeur, had never quite seen the like. The stories that survive speak of generosity almost beyond belief. They say Musa gave gold to the poor, to the merchants, to the scholars, and to the rulers. They say he built mosques in every town he passed through, as if leaving behind a trail of faith as much as a trail of dust. And they say, perhaps with some truth, perhaps with a touch of exaggeration, that the weight of his gifts was so heavy, the gold so abundant, that the markets of Cairo themselves bent under it. Gold lost its value, they claim, prices soared and fell, and for years afterward, the city remembered the tremor of that generosity. Was it truly so overwhelming? Historians still debate it. Some suggest that Musa gave away less than the legends claim, that the stories grew larger with every retelling. But perhaps it does not matter. What mattered was the impression, the sense that beyond the desert there lay a kingdom of almost mythical wealth, guided not by a reckless conqueror but by a pious, deliberate man. From Cairo, the pilgrimage continued. Musa crossed the Red Sea into Arabia, walked the sacred paths of Mecca, stood among pilgrims from every corner of the Islamic world, and completed the rituals prescribed by faith. One imagines him not as a dazzling emperor here, but as a man among men, shoulders bent in prayer, lips murmuring verses in the quiet night. To be remembered both as the richest of kings and the humblest of servants was perhaps the paradox of his life. On his return journey, Musa did not simply retrace his steps. He carried with him scholars, architects, and artisans. He brought back those who would shape Mali not only in wealth but in learning. Among them was the architect Ishaq al-Tuwaijin, credited with designing the Jingareba Mosque in Timbuktu, a structure of mud and wood that still rises today, weathered yet enduring, its minarets crowned by wooden beams like outstretched arms. Back in Mali, Musa's legacy began to take physical form. Timbuktu blossomed into a center of study, its libraries filled with manuscripts of law, astronomy, medicine, and poetry. Students traveled from across Africa to study there, and the city became a place where words were as valuable as gold dust. In Niani, the capital, new mosques were built, judges appointed, and schools established. The empire became not merely a land of riches but a land of ideas. And yet, for all his accomplishments, Musa's reign remained rooted in the quiet fabric of daily life. Farmers still rose at dawn to tend millet. Salt caravans still crossed the desert, camels groaning under their crystalline burdens. Women still pounded grain into flour. Children still splashed in the waters of the Niger, and traders still haggled in the markets. The emperor's gold may have dazzled the world, but it was these rhythms that sustained his people. After Musa's death, the empire of Mali would continue for a time, though eventually, as all empires do, it began to fray at the edges. Rival kingdoms arose, trade shifted, and the sands of the desert reclaimed what had been built. Yet the memory of Mansa Musa endured, carried in stories across continents. In Europe, where maps often drew Africa as a blank space, cartographers began sketching a king holding a golden orb, Musa, the emperor of wealth, placed like a beacon on the edge of the known world. Even centuries later, he remains a figure both famous and oddly obscure. Famous, because the scale of his wealth is still repeated in lists of the richest people in history. Obscure, because the details of his life are shrouded in the sands, his palaces long crumbled, his voice unheard except through the words of others. And so we are left with an image. A man who walked softly across the desert, whose footsteps vanished almost instantly into the wind, but whose presence bent the imagination of the world. Was he remembered for his gold more than his faith, for his empire more than his people? Or was his true legacy the quiet flowering of knowledge in Timbuktu, the gentle rhythm of villages that still whisper his name? Perhaps, as you drift towards sleep, you might imagine yourself as one of those villagers, sitting by the Niger at dusk, watching the sky fade into crimson and soot, unaware that your emperor's journey would ripple across centuries. The desert wind carries many things away, but some names, soft, golden, and persistent, seem always to remain. You might imagine medieval Europe as a land of castles, knights, and epic battles, yet the reality for most people was far more ordinary. Across the countryside, countless villages were the centers of daily survival, where ordinary lives, unnoticed by history, shaped the fabric of society. As you settle into this story, picture a small cluster of thatched cottages surrounded by fields of wheat, barley and rye, with smoke rising from stone hearths and the faint sounds of livestock in pens. The medieval village was modest, functional, and largely self-sufficient, a world where the rhythms of life were dictated by the seasons, the church calendar, and the limits of human labor. Most villagers were peasants, sometimes referred to as serfs, though the terminology and status could vary. Their work was arduous, repetitive, and largely determined by the cycles of agriculture. Wheat had to be sown in autumn or spring, harvested in summer. Oats and barley followed similar schedules. Villagers relied on hand tools, wooden plows reinforced with iron, sickles, hoes, and scythers. There were no tractors, no mechanized irrigation systems, and yet, somehow, these communities produced enough food not only to survive, but to sustain the wider feudal system. The quality and success of crops depended on the skill and diligence of each villager, from sowing seeds at the precise moment to knowing which plots of land retained moisture best during dry spells. Daily life began at dawn and ended at dusk, with few exceptions. Men and boys tended the fields and livestock, while women and girls worked both inside the home and in auxiliary fields. The distinction between domestic and public labor was fluid. Women often managed gardens, churned butter, brewed oil, prepared food, spun wool, and maintained clothing. Every task, though seemingly repetitive, was vital. Mistakes could lead to spoiled harvests, insufficient food stores, or damaged clothing, issues that had immediate, tangible consequences for survival. Villagers lived under a system of obligations to the local lord. Rent could be paid in produce labor, or a combination of both. Common lands were shared for grazing, but the boundaries and rules were strictly observed. Peasants were intimately familiar with these regulations, sometimes negotiating minor conflicts over access or usage. Life was rarely about dramatic confrontations with authority. It was about understanding the subtle rules of the system, the unspoken agreements, and the small adaptations that allowed a village to function smoothly year after year. Religion was deeply intertwined with daily existence. The local church dictated not only spiritual life, but also social schedules. Feast days, saints' days, and holy festivals punctuated work, providing structured breaks that balanced labor with ritual. Villagers observed Lent, Advent, and other periods of fasting with careful adherence, often adjusting agricultural work to accommodate celebrations. Even the humblest peasants internalized the rhythm of religious observance, finding stability in the predictability of both spiritual and seasonal calendars. Education in villages was minimal, and literacy was rare. Knowledge was transmitted orally, often through local customs, songs, and stories. Griots were not present here, but elders played a similar role, teaching younger generations how to farm, how to maintain tools, and how to manage livestock. Life skills, rather than abstract learning, were paramount. Villagers also learned through observation and apprenticeship. A boy might spend years watching his father mend fences, plow fields, or manage the rotation of crops before he could take full responsibility himself. Each seemingly boring, repetitive task was a lesson in survival, resilience, and continuity. Social life, though limited by the demands of labor, was vital for maintaining cohesion. Villagers gathered in communal spaces for markets, festivals, and collective work like threshing or repairing roads and ditches. The act of working together reinforced relationships and ensured the survival of the community. Sharing tasks allowed labor to be distributed more efficiently, while also creating social bonds that protected against isolation, disputes, and resource scarcity. Even gossip and casual conversation served as a form of information exchange, keeping villagers informed about local events, weather patterns, and the behavior of neighbors or traveling merchants. Villages also faced challenges that required constant vigilance. Poor harvests, disease, and climate variations could threaten survival. Outbreaks of smallpox, dysentery, or influenza often passed from village to village, and without effective medical knowledge, prevention relied on observation, basic hygiene, and traditional remedies. The repeated routines of cleaning living spaces, rotating crops, and boiling water, mundane acts that may seem trivial today, were critical strategies for survival. The villagers' success rested on the consistent application of these practices over time, emphasizing the importance of ordinary, disciplined labor. Trade and economy extended beyond the village boundaries. Surplus produce, wool, or crafted goods were sometimes taken to local markets in nearby towns. Traders traveled slowly, relying on pack animals or carts, and the exchange of goods depended heavily on trust, reputation, and careful record-keeping. Bartering, weighing, and measuring required precision, and even minor errors could disrupt trade relationships. For villagers, participation in these networks provided access to rare goods such as iron tools, salt, or cloth, while simultaneously teaching the practical lessons of supply, demand, and resource management. Despite the hardships, life in the medieval village was not devoid of quiet pleasures. Children played with simple toys, such as wooden dolls or hoops, while adults took pride in small domestic achievements: a well-kept garden, a sturdy fence, or a recently repaired roof. Even the most routine activities offered subtle satisfaction, marking progress and demonstrating competence. These details, though easily overlooked in historical narratives, were essential to both survival and morale. By the end of the day, villagers would return to their homes, the smoke from cooking fires rising into the twilight. The routine of tending animals, preparing food, and managing household tasks created a rhythm that was both predictable and necessary. Life was marked by repetition, yet this repetition was also the source of resilience. Each day, tasks repeated with minor variations, reinforcing knowledge, skills, and social cohesion. In this way, the ordinary labor of peasants formed the backbone of medieval society, sustaining kingdoms and enabling rulers to focus on governance, warfare, or diplomacy. And yet, even in this seemingly unremarkable existence, there are questions that quietly emerge. How did such villages maintain continuity in the face of plague, famine, and political upheaval? How did ordinary laborers influence the larger structures of power, even if their names were never recorded in chronicles? The story of the medieval village invites reflection on the subtle, often invisible forces that shaped human history. As night falls over the village, you can imagine the villagers finally resting, the faint sounds of animals settling in their pens, and the quiet rustle of leaves in the evening breeze. The survival of these communities depended not on heroic battles or dramatic events, but on the careful, repetitive work of ordinary people, the boring details that ensured life continued from one generation to the next. It is in this continuity, this measured persistence, that we see the quiet yet profound impact of daily life on the course of history. The medieval European village was a world defined by seasons. Life was dictated not by calendars on paper, but by the subtle rhythms of planting, harvesting, and weather patterns. Spring brought the promise of renewal. Fields had to be ploughed, seeds sown, and livestock tended to after the long winter months. Villagers rose at dawn to milk cows, feed chickens, and repair fences damaged by frost or snow. Tools had to be maintained, ploughshares sharpened, sickles honed, because dull equipment could make the difference between a successful harvest and famine. This careful attention to repetition and maintenance may seem mundane, Yet it was essential to survival. Summer was the time of constant vigilance. Crops grew quickly, and weeds threatened to overtake fields if not removed regularly. Villagers spent long hours bending over the soil, hoeing, weeding, and ensuring that irrigation ditches carried water where it was needed. Children assisted where they could, learning by imitation, while elders supervised and advised, ensuring that the accumulated knowledge of generations was preserved. The village was alive with movement, yet everything was measured, deliberate, and necessary. There was little time for leisure. By late summer and early autumn, the focus shifted to harvest. This was an all-consuming period, requiring nearly every able-bodied villager to participate. Grain had to be cut, bound, and stored before it spoiled, while fruits and vegetables were preserved for the coming winter. Livestock had to be fattened, and surplus produce was prepared for sale or trade. These months were exhausting, but also critically important. Failure to harvest efficiently could mean starvation for the winter months. The villagers' careful planning and routine were the invisible engines of survival, ensuring that the community endured. Winter brought its own challenges. Fields lay fallow under frost and snow, and work shifted indoors. Villagers repaired tools, spun wool into thread, and mended clothing. Food had to be rationed carefully, with grains and preserved goods measured precisely to last until spring. The winter months were quieter, but no less essential. Knowledge accumulated over months of labor became crucial during this time, understanding which roots could be stored, which grains resisted mold, and how to preserve meat and dairy required careful observation and experience. Even the cold, silent days were full of purposeful activity. Amidst these seasonal rhythms, social structures determined much of daily life. Villages were often organized under the authority of a lord, whose manor represented both governance and protection. Serfs and peasants owed labor or produce to the lord, a system that ensured the maintenance of roads, bridges, and the manor itself. While this hierarchy may seem oppressive by modern standards, it also provided stability. The rules and obligations were clear, and within these boundaries, villagers learned negotiation, compromise, and cooperation. Even mundane tasks, like maintaining communal fences or sharing oxen for ploughing, became lessons in coordination and social responsibility. Economy in the village extended far beyond the household. Craftspeople such as blacksmiths, carpenters, and potters produced essential goods. Their work may have seemed tedious, but it supported the wider community. Blacksmiths repaired plowshares and horseshoes, potters made vessels for storing grain and water, carpenters maintained buildings. Each craft relied on repetitive, disciplined work, yet each contribution had long-term consequences for survival. Without these skills, the village could not function, and the daily labor of ordinary people became the foundation of economic stability. The rhythms of work and social hierarchy were further reinforced by custom and law. Villagers knew the penalties for neglecting obligations, whether failing to attend communal labor, mismanaging resources, or disrespecting the authority of the manor. These rules were enforced subtly through observation, communal pressure, and occasional legal intervention. Daily life was therefore a balance of personal responsibility and social expectation, a quiet negotiation that shaped behavior and ensured order without constant coercion. Education remained largely practical. Children learned by doing, planting seeds, tending animals, or observing the work of elders. Knowledge was preserved orally, often codified in small rituals. The way fields were divided, the timing of crop rotations, the methods of constructing fences and homes. These lessons were repeated year after year, generation after generation. Though they may appear boring, they formed the invisible backbone of medieval civilization, ensuring that survival, stability, and continuity were possible. Villagers also faced the ever-present threats of disease, famine, and conflict. Epidemics moved slowly but relentlessly through communities. Poor harvests tested every household's resilience. Villagers responded with routine measures: boiling water, rotating crops, mending homes to protect against weather, and carefully managing stored food. In these repetitive acts lay resilience, the quiet, methodical work that prevented disaster from overwhelming the community. Even small decisions, like how to allocate grain among households or when to slaughter livestock, could ripple across the village, influencing survival rates and social cohesion. Trade and connection to the outside world added another layer of complexity. Caravans and traveling merchants brought goods, news, and sometimes disease. Villagers learned to assess risk, negotiate trade, and maintain relationships with strangers. all through repeated interactions and careful observation. These routines, mundane to the casual observer, were critical to economic survival and social stability. Even the slow movement of goods along rough roads or across rivers was guided by a combination of skill, planning, and patience. As you imagine the life of a medieval village across a year, the repetition and order become a kind of rhythm, almost meditative. Each sowing, each harvest, each meal prepared with care reinforces the lessons of patience, diligence, and observation. The villagers' resilience was not a product of heroics but of routine. The careful attention to detail that allowed communities to endure hardships for decades, even centuries. And yet, even in this disciplined, ordered life, questions linger. How did ordinary villagers shape the development of Europe without ever leaving written records? How did the boring consistency of labor, ritual, and social structure influence the course of kingdoms and empires? These questions remind us that the most powerful forces in history are often invisible, carried quietly in the repetitive work and daily lives of ordinary people. As winter falls again over the village, with hearths burning and livestock sheltered, you are left with a sense of continuity. Life proceeds, season by season, task by task. The villager's world is not dramatic or flashy, yet it is the slow, careful accumulation of knowledge, skill, and cooperation that ensures survival, and, over centuries, shapes the history of Europe itself. By the late 14th century, the medieval European village had endured centuries of routine and resilience, yet it was not immune to extraordinary challenges. Life in the village, though largely dictated by predictable rhythms, occasionally collided with forces far beyond local control: famine, disease, war, and climatic changes. These disruptions tested not only the villagers' survival skills, but also the very systems of labor, cooperation, and governance that had kept communities functioning for generations. One of the most devastating crises was famine. Agricultural failure could occur for multiple reasons: unseasonable weather, pestilence, or soil depletion. Villagers had learned to store surplus grain, rotate crops, and manage livestock carefully, yet even the best preparation could not prevent hardship in years of severe scarcity. Food was rationed meticulously, with heads of households calculating daily needs and distributing portions according to family size and social obligation. Every day, choices had to be made: which seeds to sow for the next season, which livestock to slaughter for immediate sustenance, and how to negotiate access to common resources such as pastures or wells. These boring calculations were critical to survival and ensured that, even in crisis, the village could endure. Disease was another constant threat. Plagues, smallpox, dysentery, and other infectious diseases moved slowly but relentlessly through rural communities. Villagers relied on observation, traditional remedies, and hygiene practices such as boiling water, isolating the sick, and maintaining cleanliness in living spaces. Though primitive by modern standards, these practices reflected accumulated experience and cautious trial and error learning. Knowledge about illness was shared orally, often encoded in rituals, taboos, or seasonal timing of work. Each careful step, however mundane, saved lives and maintained social stability. External threats also shaped village life. Raids, feudal conflicts, or demands from local lords imposed additional burdens. Villagers learned to respond with quiet coordination, reinforcing fences, hiding valuables, or contributing labor to fortifications. These actions, repeated across generations, formed a pattern of communal resilience. Each villager, though small in individual power, contributed to the collective defense and well-being of the community, demonstrating the cumulative impact of ordinary effort on survival and social cohesion. Trade and connections beyond the village further influenced daily life. Markets, fairs, and river crossings introduced villagers to distant goods, new techniques, and news from faraway regions. These interactions were often slow and methodical. Goods had to be measured, weighed, and exchanged fairly. Contracts or verbal agreements had to be remembered. Travelers and traders were assessed for reliability and honesty. Even seemingly minor interactions could ripple outward, influencing local economies, social alliances, and the adoption of innovations. The boring diligence of careful record-keeping, observation, and negotiation became a quiet engine of cultural and economic adaptation. Religious and communal life remained a central anchor throughout crises. Festivals, feast days, and religious observances provided both structure and psychological support, marking the passage of time and reinforcing social bonds. The parish priest, often the most educated person in the village, acted as advisor, mediator, and chronicler, Through ritual, instruction, and moral guidance, the church mediated crises, reinforced cooperative norms, and transmitted knowledge across generations. Even repetitive prayers and rituals served to stabilize the rhythm of daily life, linking mundane labor to spiritual purpose. Despite these hardships, villagers demonstrated resilience through cumulative knowledge and repeated practice. Children learned survival skills not through formal instruction, but by participating in routine tasks, observing elders, and mimicking daily rhythms. Women's work in domestic management, food preservation, and childcare ensured that households functioned even under stress. Men's labor in fields, forests, and workshops maintained material production. Craftspeople sustained essential technologies. Each role, though seemingly ordinary, reinforced a complex network of interdependence that allowed the village to endure through famine, disease, and external threats. By the end of the medieval period, many villages had become repositories of slow, accumulated knowledge. Crop rotation techniques, irrigation methods, livestock management, craft production, and communal governance were preserved across generations. Villagers' repeated attention to detail created stability, ensured continuity, and allowed small communities to influence the broader medieval world indirectly. Kings, lords, and armies relied on this quiet backbone of labor and social structure, even if they rarely acknowledged it. Perhaps most striking is the way the ordinary labor of villagers shaped historical outcomes in subtle but enduring ways. Without careful observation of seasons, meticulous preparation for winter, and disciplined attention to tools and resources, the broader structures of medieval society would have been fragile. Villages were not merely passive elements of history. They were active participants in shaping economies, preserving knowledge, and maintaining continuity. Each small act, repeated daily, contributed to the resilience of civilizations that would later endure into the Renaissance and beyond. And yet, even as we look back, questions remain. How many lessons embedded in daily life were lost when villages were abandoned or destroyed? How much knowledge, practical and social, shaped the course of history without ever being recorded? The medieval village invites reflection on the extraordinary power of ordinary, repetitive actions, the small, seemingly unremarkable work that allows societies to survive, adapt, and influence the future. As night falls over the village once again, imagine the quiet streets, the flickering firelight in cottages, and the soft sounds of livestock in their pens. Life continues, season by season, year by year, and yet these repetitions, the sowing, the harvesting, the mending, the showering, are what preserved communities through centuries of uncertainty. In the boring work of daily survival, history itself was quietly made. Imagine, if you will, a remote monastery perched on a windswept hill or nestled in a quiet valley. Outside its stone walls, the world moves with the rhythms of peasants and traders, but within, time is measured differently. The life of a monk is ruled not by feasts, markets, or military campaigns, but by repetition, order, and the careful observance of ritual. For the casual observer, this might seem monotonous, or even dull, but it is precisely in this monotony that monasteries preserved knowledge, culture, and stability through centuries of change. Monastic life begins before the first light of dawn. The bell tolls softly, rousing monks from their simple beds. Silence dominates the dormitory, interrupted only by the subtle shuffle of feet and the faint rustle of robes. This is the hour of vigils, the first of several periods of prayer that punctuate the day. Each monk moves with measured precision, washing, dressing in habits, and proceeding to the chapel. The actions are repetitive, exacting, and disciplined, emphasizing obedience and attention to detail. Even small lapses, sloppy folding of robes or missing a line in a chant, could disrupt the harmony of communal ritual, underscoring the importance of routine. Prayer itself is structured and frequent. The divine office dictates that monks gather multiple times a day, often 8 distinct times, to recite psalms, chant hymns, and meditate on sacred texts. Each session, whether at dawn's matins, mid-morning tassi, or evening vespers, follows a strict order: specific prayers, readings, and silent reflection. The repetition of words and gestures reinforces discipline and spiritual focus, training the mind to dwell not on distraction, but on continuity, presence, and reflection. This meticulous, almost hypnotic rhythm of prayer forms the core of monastic existence. Between periods of prayer, work dominates the monk's hours. The Benedictine motto ora et labora, pray and work, encapsulates the philosophy of daily life. Work may involve tending gardens, copying manuscripts, baking bread, brewing ale, or cleaning the cloisters. Each task is performed with careful attention. A scribe must maintain neat lines and correct ink consistency. A gardener must rotate crops and nurture soil. A baker must measure flour and water precisely. Even these ordinary acts are suffused with spiritual significance. Labor is seen as a form of devotion, a way to honor God through diligence and mindfulness. Meals are simple and consumed in silence. Monks eat together in the refectory, reading aloud from religious texts to nourish both body and spirit. Food is often monotonous: bread, porridge, legumes, and vegetables, occasionally supplemented by fish. Meat is rare, reflecting vows of austerity and self-discipline. The repetitive nature of meals, like other routines, reinforces moderation, patience, and communal harmony. Even eating becomes an exercise in mindfulness, attention, and restraint. A boring practice that shapes character over years of repetition. Education and study occupy another portion of monastic life. Monks read and copied texts, preserving not only sacred scripture, but also classical works on philosophy, science, and medicine. Illuminated manuscripts required painstaking attention, each letter carefully drawn, each margin adorned with symbols or decorative motifs. Errors had to be corrected meticulously, as a single miswritten line could alter meaning. The quiet, repetitive labor of copying manuscripts ensured the survival of knowledge through centuries of upheaval elsewhere in Europe. In this sense, the monotony of monastic work becomes heroic, safeguarding human learning in ways that battles or conquests rarely achieved. Monks also maintain correspondence and manage the monastery's resources. Ledgers record donations, food stores, and land rents. Gardens and orchards are monitored for yield, livestock fed, and workshops supervised. These administrative tasks, though mundane, are essential to sustaining the monastery. A lapse in bookkeeping could result in shortages. Negligence in managing land or supplies could imperil the community. In every small action, attention to detail ensures survival, continuity, and the smooth functioning of a self-contained ecosystem. The monastery is also a place of observation and reflection on time itself. The repetition of prayer, labor, and study marks the passage of days, months, and seasons. Observing the cycles of nature, when buds emerge, crops ripen, and rivers swell, becomes an act of both practical necessity and meditative reflection. Monks learn to see the extraordinary within the ordinary: a perfectly sound row of vegetables, a correctly illuminated page, or the gentle rhythm of a bell tolling in the morning fog. These details, invisible to the casual observer, are the threads that weave continuity, knowledge, and spiritual discipline. Isolation too shapes life in the monastery. Monks often have little contact with the outside world, beyond occasional visits from patrons, pilgrims, or neighboring villages. This isolation demands self-reliance, patience, and quiet introspection. Yet it also creates opportunities for meticulous observation of plants, weather patterns, animals, and even human behavior when guests arrive. Every observation becomes material for learning, reflection, or teaching. Monastic life transforms the slow accumulation of knowledge into spiritual and practical wisdom. Despite the rigid routine, small moments of human connection and subtle joy exist. The sound of a bird at dawn, the satisfaction of a freshly completed manuscript, the successful harvest of herbs, or the camaraderie of communal labor create quiet satisfaction. These small, repetitive joys form the hidden rhythms of monastic life, sustaining individuals through long periods of austerity and discipline. It is in the mundane that monks find meaning, stability, and continuity. And yet, even in this carefully ordered existence, questions arise. How did the routines of prayer, labor, and study enable monasteries to preserve knowledge through centuries of warfare and societal change? How did the quiet observation of mundane details, crop growth, ink consistency, or the timing of seasons, impact broader cultural and historical developments? These questions remind us that the boring details of life are often the invisible scaffolding upon which human civilization is built. As the day closes in the monastery, the sun casting long shadows across cloistered gardens, the monks gather for evening prayer. The rhythm of bells, chants, and silence marks the continuity of their lives, a life that seems monotonous to the outsider, yet is filled with quiet purpose, discipline, and the subtle shaping of history itself. As the seasons pass within the monastery, life may appear static to the casual observer, yet beneath the surface, monks navigate a complex web of challenges. Physical, spiritual, and administrative obstacles intersect with the rigid routines of prayer, labor, and study. Understanding these challenges reveals how monasteries became resilient institutions that influenced both local communities and the wider medieval world. One persistent challenge is the balance between labor and spiritual devotion. Monks are expected to dedicate themselves fully to God, yet practical necessities demand hours of manual and intellectual work each day. Fields must be tilled, gardens planted, bread baked, manuscripts copied, and supplies managed. The tasks are repetitive, demanding attention to detail and consistent effort. Failing to maintain the balance between work and devotion could disrupt the monastery's rhythm, threaten its economic stability, or compromise spiritual discipline. The solution lies in strict scheduling, dividing the day into precise blocks for prayer, study, and labor. Over time, this disciplined repetition becomes both habit and meditation, transforming mundane activity into a vehicle for spiritual growth. Food supply is another ongoing concern. Monasteries often strive for self-sufficiency, cultivating crops and raising animals to sustain large communities. Yet crop failures, harsh winters, or animal disease can quickly strain resources. Monks develop systems for rationing, preserving surplus, and rotating crops. Even mundane tasks such as measuring grain, monitoring soil fertility, or repairing tools are essential for survival. These seemingly boring details, repeated day after day, are what allow monastic communities to endure, often longer than neighboring secular settlements. Monasteries are also centers of knowledge and education. Copying manuscripts may appear tedious, but it is a vital form of cultural preservation. Latin, Greek, and sometimes Arabic texts are painstakingly transcribed, ensuring the survival of religious, philosophical, and scientific works. Illuminated manuscripts require exacting attention. Every letter, margin, and decoration must conform to precise standards. Monks learn patience, precision, and discipline, skills that allow the knowledge contained in these manuscripts to be transmitted intact for centuries. Without this repetitive labor, much of classical and medieval scholarship might have been lost. In addition to copying texts, monks serve as educators. Novices are trained in both religious and practical skills: literacy, gardening, animal husbandry, cooking, brewing, and tool maintenance. Knowledge is passed orally through demonstration and by repeated practice. The rhythm of daily life reinforces learning. A novice who prays, works, and studies consistently over years develops mastery through repetition. This quiet, slow accumulation of skill ensures both spiritual formation and practical competence. Interactions with the wider community create another layer of complexity. Monasteries often act as economic hubs, accepting donations, renting lands, trading surplus produce, or providing services like healing, education, and hospitality to travelers. Managing these interactions requires meticulous record-keeping, negotiation, and planning. Even minor errors, miscounting a payment, misallocating grain, or failing to maintain a bridge, could create significant problems. Daily routines, though repetitive, enable monks to manage these responsibilities with precision, reinforcing the monastery's stability and influence. The spiritual life of monks also presents internal challenges. Maintaining focus during hours of prayer, resisting distraction, and enduring physical discomfort from fasting or manual labor require constant vigilance. Silence, isolation, and the repetitive nature of daily routines are designed to cultivate mindfulness and discipline. These practices, though monotonous to outsiders, sharpen perception, encourage reflection, and develop resilience. In this way, the most ordinary acts, kneeling for prayer, turning the page of a manuscript, tending a garden, become exercises in self-mastery. Monasteries also serve as centers for innovation. Gardens become laboratories for agricultural experimentation, rotating crops, testing soil fertility, or cultivating medicinal herbs. Scriptoria experiment with inks, pigments, and writing techniques. Workshops refine tools and techniques for carpentry, blacksmithing, or brewing. These innovations are rarely recorded in chronicles, yet they spread slowly through interaction with neighboring communities, merchants, and pilgrims. The seemingly boring repetition of daily work thus becomes a vehicle for experimentation and incremental improvement, creating cumulative impacts on society. Health and hygiene are additional challenges. Monks must manage cleanliness in living quarters, kitchens, and latrines to prevent disease. Food preparation, waste disposal, and water management are all repeated tasks critical to communal well-being. Illness, whether minor or severe, can disrupt routines and jeopardize the community. Yet the discipline learned through repetition allows monks to anticipate and mitigate these risks, highlighting the quiet intelligence embedded in routine practices. Monasteries also act as mediators during crises. When famine, plague, or conflict affects nearby villages, monks distribute food, provide care and offer counsel. Their routines, daily management of supplies, accurate record keeping and disciplined work, enable effective response. Monasteries may store surplus grain for hard times, maintain gardens for medicinal plants, and provide shelter for travelers or displaced families. The predictability and organization of monastic life become a stabilizing force in an otherwise uncertain world. Through these practices, monasteries leave a profound legacy. The repeated, disciplined labor of monks preserves knowledge, sustains communities, and cultivates innovation. Their influence extends far beyond the cloister walls, shaping agriculture, scholarship, healthcare, and social stability. It is in the quiet attention to detail, the patient repetition of daily routines, and the careful observation of the ordinary that monasteries exert their enduring historical impact. And yet, questions remain: how much knowledge and culture would have been lost without the repetitive, boring labor of monastic communities? How did the small, consistent actions of monks, praying, writing, gardening, cleaning, shape the broader trajectories of European history? Even without dramatic battles or political upheavals, the monastery quietly preserves and transmits civilization. As the day draws to a close, imagine the cloisters dimming in the late afternoon light, monks finishing their work, tidying manuscripts, and preparing for evening prayer. The repetition of tasks, far from mundane, becomes a rhythm of survival, reflection, and influence. The monastery, though isolated and quiet, is an engine of continuity, quietly shaping the world outside its walls through the disciplined, careful, and methodical labor of its inhabitants. By the end of the medieval period, monasteries had become far more than isolated religious communities. Their structured routines, disciplined labor, and meticulous record-keeping produced effects that rippled far beyond their cloistered walls. While a casual observer might have dismissed a monk's day, filled with repetitive prayer, copying manuscripts, and tending gardens, as dull or monotonous, it is precisely these consistent, boring practices that preserved knowledge, fostered innovation, and stabilized society. One of the most visible legacies is the preservation and transmission of knowledge. Across centuries of warfare, plague, and political upheaval, monasteries safeguarded texts that might otherwise have been lost. Religious manuscripts ensured continuity of spiritual instruction, while classical works on medicine, mathematics, astronomy, and philosophy survived through painstaking copying. Each manuscript, copied line by line, page by page, represents not a single heroic act, but the cumulative effort of countless monks practicing patience and precision over years. The repetition of this labor became a lifeline connecting the ancient world to the Renaissance and beyond. Monasteries also contributed to the growth of literacy, education, and scholarship. Novices and young monks were trained in reading, writing, and practical skills, forming the backbone of educated society in an era when formal schooling was rare. These individuals later served as teachers, administrators, scribes, or advisors, extending the monastery's influence into broader society. Even villagers who interacted with monastic communities indirectly benefited, learning farming techniques, participating in workshops, or gaining access to medical remedies and herbal knowledge. The impact of monastic labor, therefore, was not confined to the cloisters. It was diffused through every layer of medieval society. Agriculture and economic management also bear the imprint of monastic discipline. Monks applied careful observation, experimentation, and record-keeping to cultivate gardens, orchards, and vineyards. Their work in crop rotation, soil enrichment, and irrigation was methodical and measured, gradually improving agricultural efficiency. Monasteries often managed extensive lands, balancing cultivation with animal husbandry, which required meticulous planning. This quiet expertise ensured reliable food supplies not only for the monastic community, but for nearby villages, influencing local economies and fostering resilience during periods of scarcity. Even in the realm of art and craftsmanship, monasteries left enduring contributions. Illuminated manuscripts, carved altarpieces, and carefully constructed buildings reflect precision, patience, and skill honed through repetition. Every task, no matter how small, inking a letter, weaving a pattern, shaping a stone, was performed with consistent care. These works, while subtle in the lives of those who created them, endure centuries later as both aesthetic achievements and historical documents, revealing the value of meticulous labor over fleeting inspiration. Monasteries also acted as stabilizing forces during crises. During famines, epidemics, or wars, monastic stores of food, medicinal herbs, and knowledge provided crucial support to local populations. Monks offered care, counsel, and practical assistance, drawing on the systems they had cultivated through repetitive, disciplined work. Their structured environment allowed them to respond systematically and effectively when external pressures threatened survival, showing how quiet, organized labor can amplify societal resilience. Yet the true legacy of monastic life lies in its demonstration of how small, repeated actions can shape history. The boring routines, daily prayer, the copying of texts, gardening, mending tools, form the foundation of stability, knowledge preservation, and cultural transmission. In a world fascinated by dramatic conquests, sudden inventions, and heroic exploits, the monastery reminds us that continuity, repetition, and attention to detail are equally powerful forces in shaping civilization. As centuries passed, many monasteries declined due to political upheaval, secularization, or changing societal structures. Yet even where buildings were abandoned or manuscripts lost, the systems and knowledge cultivated over generations persisted, embedded in the broader culture of Europe. Schools, hospitals, and libraries that emerged later often trace their conceptual roots to the methodical, disciplined practices developed within these quiet walls. When you imagine a monk kneeling in the dim light of a cloistered chapel, tracing letters across a page, tending herbs in a carefully divided garden, or reciting prayers at dawn, you begin to understand the magnitude of seemingly ordinary acts. These are not dramatic feats of battle or spectacle, but the consistent, meticulous labor of monks that ensured survival, preserved culture, and transmitted knowledge across centuries. And so, as we leave the monastery, it becomes clear that history is not only made in moments of grandeur or crisis. Sometimes, it is created in silence, repetition, and quiet devotion. The monastery's legacy is a testament to the enduring power of ordinary routines, structured, disciplined, and sustained over time, and the profound ways in which they shape human civilization. In reflecting on monastic life, one might ask how many other institutions, practices, or daily routines throughout history, unnoticed and repetitive, quietly shape the world. How often do the boring details hold the key to long-term survival and cultural continuity? The monastery teaches that attention to small, repeated acts can echo across generations, leaving a mark that far outlasts individual lifetimes. Imagine yourself in a dusty caravan camp somewhere between Samarkand and Changan, the morning sun rising over distant mountains. You are surrounded by the low murmur of merchants, the bleating of goats, the snorts of camels, and the shuffling of pack animals preparing for another day. The Silk Roads were not simply highways of trade, they were networks of meticulous planning, repetition, and attention to detail. Systems that allowed goods, ideas, and cultures to flow across continents for centuries. Caravan life begins before dawn. Merchants check their merchandise, counting bolts of silk, jars of spices, and stacks of precious metals. Camels and horses are fed, harnesses adjusted, and water supplies measured carefully. Each animal carries a precisely calculated load, balancing weight to prevent injury or loss. These preparations, though seemingly mundane, were critical. A mismanaged caravan could result in lost goods, delayed trade, or even death in the harsh desert. Survival depended on discipline, repetition, and careful observation. The journey itself is long, slow, and arduous. Travelers move in stages, covering a few dozen kilometers a day, often relying on established waypoints or oasis towns. These stops are not casual, they require detailed planning. Food and water must be rationed carefully. Camels must be rested to avoid collapse. Merchants exchange news, verify trade routes, and negotiate for supplies. Travelers rely on the precise timing of each stage to ensure that they reach their destination safely, avoiding sandstorms, bandits, or harsh terrain. The boring precision of these routines is what makes transcontinental commerce possible. Daily life along the Silk Roads is full of small but essential tasks. Merchants mend tents, repair harnesses, and check for spoiled food. Traders must maintain accurate inventories and calculate prices to account for local demand, taxes, and customs duties. Caravan leaders keep track of time, distance, and the condition of animals, often using simple yet reliable systems of measurement and observation. The repetition of these tasks, day after day, is what sustains the network of trade. While it may seem mundane, without these routines, the flow of goods such as silk, spices, and porcelain would falter. Security is a constant concern. Bandits and rival factions patrol certain stretches of the route, so caravans travel in groups, sometimes numbering hundreds of people and animals. Guards are assigned specific duties, watch rotations are scheduled, and defensive formations practiced. Every step, from the arrangement of baggage to the placement of sentries, is guided by the accumulated experience of centuries. Even minor lapses, an unsecured gate, a distracted guard, or a poorly timed rest stop, could result in devastating losses. Repetition and discipline become a form of protection, a quiet yet critical defense against unpredictable dangers. Interactions with local settlements are both routine and essential. Caravan stops at towns like Bukhara, Kashgar, or Dunhuang involve negotiating with innkeepers, traders, and tax collectors. Merchants must understand local customs, weights, measures, and currencies. Even small mistakes, misweighing silk, misunderstanding coinage, or miscommunicating language, can lead to disputes or financial loss. The meticulous repetition of counting, measuring, and recording becomes an invisible infrastructure supporting the larger system of trade. Life along the Silk Roads is not without moments of connection. Merchants exchange stories, travelers share news from distant lands, and goods from faraway regions inspire curiosity. Yet the rhythm of the journey remains unbroken. Days are filled with routine walking, riding, counting, repairing, and negotiating. The monotony is punctuated by necessary adjustments, finding water in a dry season, adjusting pace to protect weak animals, or avoiding dangerous terrain. It is in these careful, repeated adjustments that the success of long-distance trade is secured. Knowledge flows quietly alongside goods. Traders observe weather patterns, study maps, and learn routes by heart. Information about markets, political stability, and local customs spreads slowly through repeated conversations and careful record-keeping. Even seemingly trivial observations, how camels respond to a particular oasis, which spices maintain freshness in transport, or which towns are safe for overnight stays, accumulate over years, forming a vast, practical knowledge network that underpins international commerce. The Silk Roads also connect cultures, religions, and ideas. Monks, scholars, and artisans travel alongside merchants, sharing philosophies, artistic techniques, and technological innovations. Yet these exchanges rely on the same meticulous logistics that sustain trade: careful timing, planning, and repetition. Without these routines, the movement of knowledge would be far slower, if not impossible. The boring tasks, measuring, recording, repairing, rationing, create the conditions for extraordinary cultural and economic exchange. As the caravan rests in the evening, the smell of cooking fires mingles with the dry desert air. Camels kneel, travelers eat a modest meal, and preparations begin for the night's security. You might notice nothing remarkable, yet the cumulative effect of these repetitive actions ensures survival, preserves goods, and allows trade and culture to flow across thousands of miles. The extraordinary achievements of the Silk Roads are, at their core, sustained by the ordinary diligence of countless individuals over centuries. And yet, even in this disciplined routine, questions linger. How did ordinary merchants, through repetition and careful observation, shape global trade networks that connected continents? How did the accumulation of mundane knowledge, rotes, weights, measures, and customs transform civilizations without ever being recorded in official histories? The Silk Roads remind us that the backbone of history is often hidden in the everyday, repetitive work of ordinary people. As night falls across the desert, with stars stretching overhead and the faint sound of animals settling, the caravan embodies a quiet, persistent rhythm. It is this rhythm, the careful planning, repetition, and attention to detail, that makes possible the extraordinary story of human connection across vast distances. While the Silk Roads are often romanticized as highways of exotic trade, the reality for merchants, guides, and caravan workers was defined by endurance, meticulous planning, and relentless attention to routine. For every bolt of silk or jar of spices that reached distant markets, countless repetitive tasks ensured survival: measuring loads, tending animals, counting coins, and negotiating fees. These details, seemingly boring, were crucial to the functioning of a trade network stretching thousands of kilometers across deserts, mountains, and river valleys. One of the greatest challenges was the environment itself. Deserts, mountains, and steppe regions tested both human and animal endurance. Sandstorms could appear suddenly, snow could block mountain passes, and rivers could swell unexpectedly, threatening to sweep away caravans. Merchants had to anticipate these dangers through observation, knowledge passed down through generations, and careful planning. Water sources and grazing areas for camels were meticulously mapped and marked, and every stop had to be timed precisely to avoid exhaustion or death. These tasks, repeated journey after journey, formed the invisible scaffolding of successful trade. Banditry and political instability presented another persistent threat. Armies, raiders, or local militias could attack caravans, demanding tolls or seizing goods. Merchants developed routines to minimize risk traveling in large groups, rotating guards, and placing more valuable cargo in the center of the caravan. Even seemingly minor details, like tying loads securely, maintaining watch schedules, or observing local customs, could prevent disaster. The repetitive vigilance of these routines allowed caravans to navigate regions that might otherwise be too dangerous, ensuring that goods and knowledge reached their destinations. Disease and illness were constant companions. Travelers faced dehydration, malnutrition, or infection. Animals could fall ill or die, disrupting schedules and threatening the livelihood of the caravan. To mitigate these risks, merchants developed habits that were both practical and repetitive, ensuring proper hydration, rotating workloads, checking animals' feet and hooves, and preparing simple but nourishing meals. Small methodical acts, cleaning water containers, inspecting supplies and monitoring symptoms, saved lives. In this way, ordinary diligence became a critical survival strategy on the Silk Roads. Human stories also emerge within the repetitive rhythm of caravan life. A merchant may rise before dawn for weeks on end, checking goods, feeding animals, and walking alongside pack animals across miles of desert. Guides memorize long stretches of terrain, noticing subtle changes in rock formations or vegetation that signal hidden dangers or water sources. Family members accompanying the caravan endure the same routines: cooking, cleaning, repairing tents, and caring for children. These repetitive actions, though unglamorous, bind people together and shape resilience, trust, and cooperation. Trade itself is defined by repetition and careful observation. Merchants must measure quantities, weigh metals, evaluate silk threads, and ensure spices retain freshness. Every market stop involves recording purchases, negotiating prices, and verifying local currencies. Even small errors, miscounting bolts of silk or miscalculating taxes, could cascade into significant financial loss. Success along the Silk Roads depended less on luck or charisma and more on the precise execution of these repetitive, detail-oriented tasks. Cultural exchange follows the same pattern. Monks, artisans, and scholars traveling with caravans carry religious texts, artistic motifs, or technological knowledge. These exchanges often occur quietly and incrementally, a drawing copied here, a prayer recited there, a medicinal technique shared in a small village. These interactions rely on the same repetitive routines that sustain trade: careful observation, measured interaction, and patient replication of practices. Over decades, centuries, and thousands of miles, these small actions accumulate into profound cultural impact. Local settlements along the Silk Roads also depend on this rhythm. Inns, caravanserais, and markets function efficiently only because merchants and travelers adhere to routines, arriving at certain times, paying fees, and following established protocols. The repeated patterns of travel and exchange create a predictable structure that allows commerce to thrive despite environmental, political, and social challenges. Stability emerges from repetition, even in regions that might appear chaotic or unpredictable. Even within moments of leisure or storytelling, repetition structures experience. Travelers share news, recount prior journeys, or retell lessons learned on previous trips. Stories, songs, and practical knowledge are repeated daily, reinforcing memory and transmitting culture. Each repetition preserves not only facts but also wisdom about navigation, weather, trade ethics, and survival strategies. What might seem like a mundane recounting of past events is actually a vital method for preserving knowledge and guiding future generations along the Silk Roads. Yet questions remain about the human dimension of these journeys. How did ordinary merchants and caravan workers, through repetition and diligence, shape economic networks that spanned continents? How did the accumulation of small, methodical acts, recording weights, rationing food, watching for hazards, create enduring pathways for trade, culture, and ideas? The Silk Roads remind us that grand historical movements often depend on the quiet, repetitive labor of countless individuals who are rarely mentioned in chronicles. As the sun sets behind distant mountains, caravans settle into camps, fires crackling softly in the desert night. Merchants check their animals once more, secure their goods, and prepare for another day of repetition. In this rhythm, counting, measuring, observing, repairing, lies the enduring power of human diligence. the Silk Roads endured not through sudden inspiration or heroic feats, but through countless ordinary acts, repeated faithfully over generations, connecting continents and shaping civilizations. The Silk Roads were not built in a day, nor were they maintained by grand events or dramatic conquests alone. Instead, they existed because of the slow, careful work of countless individuals whose daily routines ensured the movement of goods, knowledge, and culture across continents. While travelers, merchants, and guides often performed repetitive, seemingly mundane tasks, measuring silk, rationing water, counting coins, the cumulative effect of these small actions shaped civilizations in profound and lasting ways. Economically, the Silk Roads created intercontinental networks that connected China, Central Asia, the Middle East, and Europe. Luxury goods like silk, spices, and precious metals flowed alongside everyday items like salt, grain, and ceramics. Yet the success of these networks relied less on the value of goods themselves and more on the meticulous routines that sustained trade. Daily inspections of merchandise, careful preparation of caravans, and disciplined record-keeping allowed goods to traverse deserts, mountains, and rivers safely. These repetitive actions created trust and predictability, essential for long-distance commerce in a world without modern communication or transport systems. The roads also enabled the transmission of knowledge. Scientific, technological, and cultural ideas spread alongside physical goods. Papermaking techniques, medical practices, religious texts, and artistic motifs traveled slowly but steadily, carried by those who moved deliberately along these networks. The repetition of copying manuscripts, retelling stories, and recording observations ensured that knowledge survived across distances and generations. A minor oversight, a forgotten measurement, a miscopied character, could alter meaning, highlighting how crucial the mundane, precise labor of ordinary people was to history. Human resilience, honed along the Silk Roads, played an equally important role. Travelers faced extreme weather, scarce water, disease, and banditry, yet survival depended on consistent routines, daily inspections of animals, careful rationing of food and water, timely navigation between waypoints. Each caravan journey exemplifies the power of repetition and diligence. By managing countless small details, merchants and guides ensured that goods reached distant markets, and that cultural exchange occurred, even under the harshest conditions. The social and cultural impact of the Silk Roads is also rooted in these repetitive acts. Caravanserais, inns, and markets functioned efficiently because travelers followed predictable patterns. Local communities benefited from trade, adopting innovations in agriculture, craft, and technology observed from passing merchants. Religious and philosophical ideas traveled in the same unglamorous rhythm, a scripture copied here, a ritual observed there, a conversation repeated in another town. Through these small, ordinary actions, civilizations became increasingly interconnected. Perhaps the most profound lesson of the Silk Roads is how ordinary, repetitive labor shapes history in invisible yet enduring ways. Historians often focus on kings, battles, or dramatic events, but the Silk Roads show that sustained, disciplined action, performed consistently by individuals, can influence entire continents. Every calculated ration of water, every careful measurement of silk, every meticulously recorded trade transaction contributed to a network that transformed economies, cultures, and ideas across millennia. By the time the roads began to decline due to maritime trade and political instability, their legacy had already been secured. Cities that had flourished as caravan hubs continued to thrive culturally and economically. Knowledge carried along these routes influenced scientific developments, artistic styles, and philosophical thought for centuries. Even when physical roads fell into disuse, the networks of trust, observation, and procedural discipline left by those who traveled them endured in local customs, practices, and economic habits. As night falls across the vast deserts, mountains, and valleys that once echoed with the low sounds of caravans, one can imagine the quiet diligence of merchants, guides, and travelers. The slow, repetitive actions, the careful measurement, the rationing, the observation, the record-keeping, may have seemed insignificant at the time. Yet these actions enabled the remarkable achievements of the Silk Road's global connection, cultural exchange, and the survival of goods and knowledge across thousands of miles. And so, when we reflect on the Silk Roads, we recognize that the extraordinary is often built on the ordinary. The roads themselves, and the civilizations they connected, owe their existence not to single heroic acts, but to the patient, persistent, and meticulous labor of countless individuals. The story of the Silk Roads is a reminder that history is not only forged in dramatic moments, but also in the quiet, repetitive, and boring work that allows civilization to endure. In contemplating these journeys, one may ask how many other global networks, cultural exchanges, or innovations arose silently from repetitive, disciplined effort. How much of our modern world owes its existence to ordinary actions repeated faithfully over generations? The Silk Roads leave us with a lesson: the power of consistent, mundane effort can ripple across continents, shaping the course of history in ways that are subtle, invisible, yet extraordinary. Imagine standing on the edge of a dense forest or a rocky hilltop at dawn, somewhere at the periphery of a medieval kingdom. The frontier is neither bustling town nor serene countryside. It is a place of constant vigilance, slow progress, and meticulous preparation. Here, soldiers, settlers, and laborers navigate daily life where the ordinary and the dangerous intersect. Survival depends less on dramatic heroics and more on repetition, routine, and careful observation of the environment. Life on the frontier begins with the sun, often before it rises. Soldiers awaken to the rhythm of the bugle or the clanging of a bell, while settlers stir in rudimentary cottages made of timber, wattle, and daub. Everyone begins the day by checking tools, weapons, and supplies. Axes must be sharpened, armor inspected, and cooking implements cleaned. Livestock is fed and watered, and fields or gardens are examined for damage caused by wildlife or weather. These tasks, seemingly mundane, are critical. A dull axe, a leaky well, or a sick animal can have cascading consequences in a remote self-reliant community. Frontier life is dominated by repetitive labor. Soldiers drill with weapons, maintain fortifications, and patrol borders. Settlers dig ditches, plant crops, build fences, or repair roofs. Each task is performed with attention to detail because errors can threaten life and livelihood. Soldiers learn the precise movement of weapons, the coordination of small units, and the rhythm of guard duty. Settlers, on the other hand, master soil rotation, livestock management, and preservation techniques to ensure the community's survival. Repetition, while monotonous, builds competence and reduces the risk of fatal mistakes. Food preparation and rationing are critical daily activities. Frontier communities must often rely on stored grains, salted meat, and preserved vegetables during long winters or dry seasons. Meals are simple and carefully portioned: bread, porridge, legumes, and whatever protein is available from hunting or domesticated animals. Settlers and soldiers alike must plan for scarcity, measuring supplies, rotating stores, and ensuring that no food spoils. The discipline of consistent rationing allows communities to endure harsh conditions and avoid famine. Communication and coordination are essential yet often overlooked aspects of frontier life. Scouts and messengers travel between settlements, delivering reports of enemy movements, weather changes, or resource shortages. These communications rely on exact timing and repetition. Routes must be memorized, signals standardized, and messages recorded accurately. Even minor mistakes, a misread sign, a delayed message, or a forgotten supply order, can have severe consequences. The careful, repeated adherence to these practices underpins the security and efficiency of frontier settlements. The natural environment dominates daily routines. Villagers and soldiers observe animal behavior, monitor streams for flooding, and note seasonal changes in vegetation. Such observations are repeated day after day, forming a subtle but critical knowledge base. For example, noticing when birds migrate, when streams rise, or when soil becomes saturated informs planting schedules, hunting practices, and defensive strategies. The frontier teaches that survival often depends on paying attention to small, repetitive details that others might overlook. Even leisure follows structured patterns. Time for storytelling, religious observance, or simple games is carefully scheduled, often after work or guard duty. These moments, though brief, reinforce social cohesion and mental resilience. Villagers and soldiers repeat these practices daily or weekly, embedding a rhythm that sustains morale and community identity. The repetition is comforting in an unpredictable environment, offering stability amid potential threats from nature or human conflict. Security is a constant undercurrent. Soldiers maintain watchtowers, patrol perimeters, and inspect weapons regularly. Settlers reinforce fences, sharpen tools for defense, and sometimes participate in militia drills. These tasks, repetitive in nature, are vital for survival. A single lapse, a guard falling asleep, a door left unsecured, a weapon unsharpened, could lead to attack, theft, or worse. The monotony of preparation masks its profound importance. Life on the frontier is safe only because individuals perform these routines diligently, day after day. Social hierarchies and cooperation are reinforced through repetition. Settlers and soldiers rely on each other's labor and vigilance. Tasks are divided according to ability, experience, and status, but everyone contributes to the collective welfare. Even minor acts, carrying water, tending fires, mending clothes, are repeated countless times, building resilience, trust, and interdependence. Over time, these ordinary acts create a strong, functioning community capable of withstanding both environmental and human threats. Frontier life is also punctuated by crises that test the limits of preparation. Encounters with hostile forces, wild animals, or sudden natural disasters force communities to rely on their accumulated routines and knowledge. The repetition of prior preparation, stockpiling supplies, conducting drills, observing terrain, determines survival. Here, the boring details of daily life are revealed as extraordinary tools for endurance and resilience. Yet, even with all this preparation, questions linger. How did frontier communities balance survival, labor, and vigilance over decades? How much knowledge about weather patterns, resource management, or local geography was quietly transmitted through repeated daily routines? Life on the medieval frontier reminds us that human endurance and societal continuity often hinge not on dramatic events but on small, persistent, and methodical actions. As evening falls, imagine the sounds of the frontier settling into a nightly rhythm. Fires crackling in cottages, the low bleating of sheep, distant watchmen calling the hours, and soldiers checking their posts one last time. The repetitive routines of work, vigilance, and preparation continue unseen, quietly sustaining the fragile equilibrium of frontier life. It is in these ordinary, repeated actions that survival and human resilience are forged, laying the groundwork for communities to endure through centuries of uncertainty. Life on the medieval frontier is defined not only by daily routines, but also by the ever-present threat of conflict. Soldiers and settlers alike face dangers ranging from raiding parties and feuding neighbors to wild animals and harsh natural conditions. Yet survival is rarely determined by heroic actions alone. Instead, it is the repetitive, disciplined performance of seemingly mundane tasks, patrolling, maintaining weapons, rationing supplies, that allows communities to endure. One of the most persistent challenges is the threat of raiding or attack. Frontiers often lie on the edges of kingdoms, contested by rival lords, wandering bandits, or local tribes. Soldiers maintain strict rotations of guard duty, inspecting fortifications and patrolling perimeters daily. Even minor lapses, a misaligned gate, an unobservant sentry, or a poorly maintained watchtower, could invite disaster. The repetition of these protective measures creates a rhythm of vigilance that, though monotonous, ensures safety over the long term. Settlers also participate in defensive measures. Fields are planted in locations that can be easily defended, fences are regularly repaired, and livestock is corralled in secure enclosures each night. These repetitive tasks, often overlooked in dramatic accounts of history, are crucial for survival. A single night of neglect, an unlocked barn door or a broken fence, could result in the loss of essential food stores or draft animals, threatening the entire community. In this way, boring diligence is the backbone of frontier resilience. Crises do not always stem from human threats. Harsh weather, drought, and disease frequently test the limits of frontier communities. Crops may fail after a late frost, water sources dry up, or livestock fall ill. Settlers and soldiers rely on routines developed over generations, rotating crops, monitoring soil moisture, storing grains, and observing the signs of seasonal change. Small repeated acts, checking wells, reinforcing roofs, tending livestock, become survival strategies. Each day's work accumulates into a body of knowledge that allows communities to endure the unpredictability of frontier life. Even during conflicts, the mundane details matter. When raiders approach, soldiers do not rush blindly into battle. They check weapons, reinforce gates, and ensure that supplies are accessible. Settlers follow established protocols, moving children and elders to secure areas, hiding food and valuables, and lighting signal fires to alert nearby allies. The successful defense of a village or fort is rarely a matter of heroism alone. It depends on the meticulous execution of rehearsed routines, the same actions repeated countless times during peacetime to ensure readiness. Daily life is also shaped by economic survival. Frontier communities must balance work, defense, and resource management. Fields must be plowed, animals fed, and repairs carried out, even under threat. Markets or trade posts are small but essential sources of supplies, requiring careful negotiation and observation. Every day, settlers weigh the cost of labor against available resources, deciding how much to harvest, preserve, or trade. These repetitive calculations ensure that the community can withstand both scarcity and sudden emergencies. Human stories emerge in these rhythms of repetition. A blacksmith, for instance, hammers sword after sword, each stroke precise, knowing that a flawed weapon could endanger lives. A scout rides the same path day after day, memorizing landmarks, weather patterns, and enemy movements. Children learn survival skills through repeated tasks, fetching water, tending animals, or learning to recognize edible plants. Over time, these repetitive acts accumulate into experience, skill, and resilience. The mundane tasks of daily life quietly shape the next generation's capacity to endure frontier hardships. Religion and ritual provide structure and psychological support. Daily prayers, seasonal festivals, and communal gatherings punctuate otherwise grueling routines. These repeated practices offer comfort, reinforce social cohesion, and provide a framework for moral and ethical decision-making. In the midst of uncertainty, they become stabilizing forces, reminding settlers and soldiers that their lives are part of a larger, meaningful order. Even in moments of leisure or respite, repetition continues to structure experience. Storytelling, songs, and crafts are passed down through regular practice, reinforcing memory and teaching lessons about survival, history, and ethics. The cumulative effect of repetition, whether in labor vigilance or social rituals, creates continuity in communities that might otherwise be fragmented by distance, danger, and scarcity. Yet, despite these routines, uncertainty remains. How do communities on the frontier adapt to sudden threats while maintaining daily survival? How do repetitive, mundane actions shape resilience over decades of conflict and environmental stress? The frontier teaches that human endurance often depends less on singular acts of courage and more on the persistent repetition of small, methodical, and disciplined behaviors. As the sun sets over forested hills and river valleys, frontier communities settle into evening routines. Soldiers check weapons and gates once more, settlers tend fires and animals, and quiet vigilance permeates the night. It is in these repeated, ordinary actions, practiced day after day, that life on the frontier persists. The mundane routines of survival, repeated tirelessly, are the invisible foundation that allows communities to endure centuries of uncertainty, conflict, and environmental challenge. The medieval frontier, with its forests, hills, and borderlands, often appears in history as a place of hardship, danger, and marginal existence. Yet the enduring legacy of these regions lies not in grand battles or heroic figures, but in the repeated, meticulous routines that allowed communities to survive, thrive, and shape the broader medieval world. Soldiers, settlers, and laborers developed systems of vigilance, resource management, and social cooperation that ensured continuity in an unpredictable environment. Economically, frontier communities contributed to the expansion of medieval kingdoms. Settlers cultivated lands that were previously untamed, producing food and raw materials to supply both local populations and nearby towns. Careful observation of soil, water availability, and seasonal changes allowed these communities to maximize yields despite harsh conditions. The repeated tasks of planting, harvesting, and preserving crops ensured not only survival, but also economic stability. Over generations, these routines laid the foundation for prosperous towns and trade networks, demonstrating the importance of consistent, methodical labor. Military organization on the frontier also shaped political and social structures. Soldiers and local militias relied on repetitive drills, rotation of watch duties, and inspection of fortifications to maintain security. These routines, though mundane, created disciplined and resilient forces capable of defending borders against raiders or rival lords. Over time, the practices and hierarchies established on the frontier informed military organization in more centralized regions, contributing to the professionalization of armies and the development of defensive strategies that persisted for centuries. Human resilience, cultivated through repetition, is perhaps the most significant legacy. Children learned survival skills through daily routines, blacksmiths honed their craft through repeated strikes, and scouts memorized terrain by traveling the same paths countless times. These ordinary, persistent actions accumulated into a profound body of practical knowledge, allowing frontier communities to adapt to environmental challenges, social pressures, and unexpected crises. The quiet labor of everyday life became a foundation of long-term survival. Cultural and social life was also reinforced through repeated practice. Communal rituals, religious observances, and festivals provided structure and stability, weaving a sense of identity and continuity into frontier communities. These repetitive practices maintained cohesion in regions often isolated from central authority. Oral traditions, songs, and stories were passed down with regularity, teaching younger generations the skills, values, and ethics necessary for life in challenging circumstances. In this sense, repetition was not merely functional but formative, shaping the character and culture of communities over generations. Even the architecture and infrastructure of frontier settlements reflect the power of persistent, ordinary labor. Fortified walls, watchtowers, bridges, and irrigation systems were not constructed overnight. They were the product of repeated, careful effort over years. Each repair, reinforcement, or incremental improvement contributed to the long-term resilience of the settlement. Without these small, often unnoticed acts, communities would have been far more vulnerable to both environmental hazards and human threats. Frontier life teaches an enduring lesson about the nature of history itself. While chronicles often highlight dramatic events, battles, or rulers, the daily repetitive work of ordinary people often determines the real trajectory of communities and civilizations. In the forests, hills, and borderlands of medieval Europe, survival and continuity depended on repeated, disciplined actions tending animals, maintaining defenses, managing resources, and observing the natural world. These acts, though boring, in isolation, collectively shaped economic stability, social cohesion, and cultural continuity. Reflecting on the frontier, one may wonder, how many other communities throughout history relied on repetition, vigilance, and routine to survive, only to be overlooked by traditional historical narratives? How much of civilization's endurance, through war, famine, or environmental challenge, depends on ordinary actions performed faithfully over generations? The medieval frontier reminds us that history is not only the story of kings, battles, or grand achievements, but also of ordinary people practicing extraordinary diligence in the small, repeated tasks of daily life. As night descends on the frontier, fires flicker in cottages, soldiers rotate guards, and settlers tend livestock one final time. The rhythms of survival, routine, repetition, and careful attention to detail continue quietly, sustaining life in a fragile environment. It is through these persistent, ordinary actions that frontier communities endure, shaping history not through singular heroics, but through the quiet accumulation of disciplined, methodical effort. In this, the frontier's legacy is both subtle and profound. Ordinary acts, repeated faithfully, leave an extraordinary mark on the world. Imagine waking at dawn in a bustling medieval town, where cobblestone streets wind between timber-framed houses, marketplaces hum with activity, and the scent of baking bread and livestock fills the air. Life in these towns is governed less by dramatic events than by repetition. The daily rhythm of work, trade, and domestic tasks sustains the community, shaping both economic and social life. The day begins early. Bakers and millers rise before sunrise to prepare bread for townsfolk, grinding grain, kneading dough, and lighting ovens. Each loaf requires precision, the right temperature, timing, and kneading technique determine whether the bread is edible or wasted. Meanwhile, blacksmiths stoke fires, hammering iron into nails, tools, or horseshoes, attending to every detail to ensure their work serves both function and durability. Repetition is key. Mastery is achieved not in a single strike but in hundreds, repeated day after day. Merchants open stalls in the marketplace, arranging bolts of cloth, baskets of vegetables, jars of preserved goods, and exotic imports. Trade relies on precise observation and routine, measuring cloth by the correct length, weighing spices accurately, and checking coins for authenticity. Even minor errors could lead to disputes, financial loss, or damaged reputation. The repeated attention to these small details ensures trust and smooth economic exchange, forming the backbone of urban commerce. Domestic life mirrors the rhythm of the market. Households rise early to sweep floors, fetch water, and prepare meals. Women and men engage in spinning, weaving, and sewing, often producing goods for both personal use and sale. Children assist in chores, learning through repetition the practical skills they will need in adulthood. Simple acts, chopping firewood, washing linens, tending animals, are repeated daily, creating a reliable framework for survival and social stability. Craftsmanship, a defining feature of medieval towns, is rooted in repetition. Artisans such as shoemakers, carpenters, and potters refine their skills by performing the same tasks countless times, cutting leather, shaping wood, or molding clay. Quality emerges from patient, methodical labor. While these actions may seem mundane, they produce the durable tools, clothing, and structures that sustain urban life. The town thrives not through single bursts of innovation, but through the steady accumulation of expertise over years and decades. Hygiene and health, though often limited by the period's knowledge, require consistent effort. Streets are swept, waste is removed, and wells are monitored for contamination. Households follow routines of cleaning and food preparation to avoid disease, particularly in densely populated areas. These repetitive acts, though unremarkable, reduce illness and support community resilience. The survival of a medieval town depends on such attention to detail, day after day. Trade extends beyond the local marketplace. Towns serve as nodes in wider networks, receiving goods from the countryside, distant cities, or even foreign lands. Caravans and riverboats bring grains, spices, and textiles, which are then distributed through meticulous record keeping and inventory management. Merchants and town officials repeat these administrative tasks with precision, ensuring that commerce functions smoothly. The repetition of counting, weighing, and recording transforms chaotic exchange into a reliable system. Religious life punctuates the town's daily rhythm. Bells mark the hours for prayer, processions occur on feast days, and regular church attendance structures social life. Even for townsfolk engaged in labor or trade, repeated acts of devotion offer stability and moral guidance. Routine prayers, blessings, and observances weave a subtle but continuous framework into everyday life, linking economic and social activity with spiritual practice. Conflict, while less overt than on a frontier, is always present. Guild regulations, disputes between merchants, and competition over resources require negotiation and adherence to local laws. Magistrates, councillors, and guild leaders rely on repeated observation, record keeping, and procedural consistency to maintain order. Ordinary citizens participate by following established norms and routines, reinforcing social cohesion. Even seemingly mundane acts, paying taxes on time, attending meetings, observing guild rules, contribute to the town's stability. As afternoon turns to evening, the town begins its gradual transition from work to rest. Merchants close stalls, artisans clean workshops, and households prepare meals for the evening. Children play in narrow streets while adults tend fires and livestock. The day's repetitive routines, though ordinary, have created a structured, functioning community. Every loaf of bread baked, nail hammered, or transaction recorded is part of the invisible machinery that keeps the town alive and thriving. Yet questions linger. How did these ordinary, repetitive routines sustain towns over centuries of economic fluctuation, disease, and political change? How much of urban survival depended on the invisible rhythm of daily life, rather than dramatic events? Medieval towns remind us that the endurance of human communities is built on repeated, disciplined acts, each small and seemingly mundane, but collectively powerful. As night falls, the streets quiet, fires glow in windows, and the town settles into a predictable rhythm. The work of the day is complete, but tomorrow will repeat the same patterns: early rising, preparation, trade, craft, and community routines. In this repetition lies the quiet, enduring power of medieval urban life, a reminder that history often advances not through grand gestures but through ordinary, consistent labor performed faithfully over generations. Medieval towns were vibrant hubs of activity, but life there was far from simple. Beyond the familiar rhythms of baking, crafting, and trading, residents faced crises that tested their resilience: fires, disease, political disputes, and economic fluctuations. Yet even amid uncertainty, the repetition of daily routines, careful record keeping, meticulous hygiene, structured labor, and adherence to local regulations provided stability, enabling towns to endure and adapt. One of the most immediate threats was fire. Timber-framed houses, narrow streets, and open hearths made towns highly flammable. Bakers, blacksmiths, and households practiced repetitive fire safety measures, maintaining embers in contained hearths, clearing flammable debris from alleys, and monitoring ovens. Town authorities reinforced these routines through regulations, imposing fines for negligence and organizing watch groups to patrol the streets. The repetition of these mundane precautions reduced the frequency and severity of devastating fires, preserving lives and property. Disease was another constant concern. Medieval towns often lacked clean water and effective waste disposal, creating conditions for outbreaks of plague, dysentery, or other illnesses. Daily routines became critical defenses: cleaning streets, maintaining wells, segregating waste, and observing basic hygiene. Households followed repetitive habits, washing utensils, boiling water, and preparing food carefully to prevent contamination. Even the repetition of small, seemingly insignificant acts could mean the difference between survival and epidemic. Economic challenges also shaped daily life. Markets fluctuated in response to harvests, regional conflicts, or the arrival of distant goods. Merchants relied on routine bookkeeping, regular pricing checks, and inventory management to maintain financial stability. Craftsmen ensured that their tools were maintained and techniques repeated consistently to produce quality goods. These ordinary, repetitive acts stabilized trade and craftsmanship, allowing towns to weather unpredictable economic conditions. Social dynamics within towns were governed by structured routines as well. Guilds regulated labor, apprenticeship, and trade standards. Repetition of guild practices, attending meetings, following craft protocols, and observing hierarchical duties ensured fair competition and maintained social cohesion. Ordinary citizens, through daily interactions, reinforced these structures by adhering to norms, participating in community obligations, and repeating established patterns of behavior. In this way, repetitive routines created a subtle yet powerful social order. Crises often revealed human resilience. When a fire broke out in a market district, townsfolk organized firefighting brigades, bucket brigades passing water from well to well in precise, repetitive motions. During outbreaks of illness, volunteers followed strict routines of care, isolation, and sanitation. Even minor tasks, cleaning streets, preparing medicinal herbs, or transporting water, became acts of collective survival. The repetition of these actions, day after day, ensured that towns could recover and continue functioning despite challenges. Daily life was also shaped by patterns of leisure and socialization. Festivals, religious observances, and communal gatherings punctuated the repetitive routines of work. These events were themselves structured rituals, followed the same sequence each year. Songs and stories were repeated, and food preparation adhered to long-practiced methods. Through repetition, towns maintained cultural continuity and reinforced communal identity, even as external threats loomed. Children learned their roles through repetition, assisting in family trades, performing household chores, and practicing crafts. Apprenticeship in guilds followed strict routines, tasks were repeated until mastered, lessons reinforced through constant practice. The ordinary repetition of work and study ensured the transfer of knowledge, skills, and values across generations, strengthening the community's long-term resilience. Conflict and negotiation were also part of town life, albeit in subtler forms than on the frontier. Disputes between neighbors, competition among merchants, and interactions with local authorities required careful observation, patience, and repeated adherence to procedures. Recording agreements, verifying weights and measures, and following legal protocols were all repetitive acts that maintained order. Over time, these practices established norms and trust, stabilizing urban life despite the underlying tension and unpredictability. Even the quiet moments of daily life reveal the importance of repetition. Street sweepers follow the same paths, water carriers traverse familiar routes, and families follow morning and evening routines. These small, repeated acts create predictability and structure, forming the invisible infrastructure that allows towns to function. Without this rhythm, life in densely populated urban centers would have been chaotic and dangerous. Yet questions linger. How much of a medieval town's resilience depended on the faithful repetition of routine, rather than sudden innovation or heroic action? How did ordinary citizens, through the accumulation of daily habits, craft a social and economic order capable of surviving disease, fire, and conflict? Medieval towns teach us that the endurance of communities is often grounded in small, persistent, and methodical actions repeated over generations. As night falls, the streets quiet, shop shutters close, fires flicker in windows, and townsfolk settle into predictable evening routines. The work of the day may be ordinary and repetitive, but its cumulative effect sustains life, preserves knowledge, and maintains social cohesion. It is in these repeated acts, baking, cleaning, recording, repairing, that medieval towns endure, demonstrating the extraordinary power of ordinary, disciplined labor. Medieval towns were not merely clusters of buildings and markets, they were living systems sustained by repetition, discipline, and meticulous daily routines. While history often highlights wars, plagues, or royal decrees, the enduring success of towns relied on countless ordinary acts: baking bread, tending livestock, maintaining workshops, and observing social and religious protocols. These repeated actions created the stability necessary for commerce, culture, and social cohesion to flourish. Economically, towns became centers of trade and craft because of these daily routines. Bakers, blacksmiths, carpenters, and merchants contributed to the local economy through consistent, methodical labor. Craftsmanship depended on repetition. The same tools were sharpened, bolts of cloth measured, and loaves baked in identical routines day after day. The cumulative effect of these repetitive tasks allowed towns to thrive despite challenges such as poor harvests, disease outbreaks, or political instability. Ordinary labor formed the backbone of urban prosperity, proving that sustained effort often outweighs singular acts of innovation. Socially, repetition maintained order and cohesion. Guilds regulated trades, apprenticeships, and professional standards, while town councils and local authorities oversaw markets, taxes, and public safety. Citizens reinforced these structures through adherence to daily norms, observing curfews, attending religious services, paying dues, and participating in communal work. Even leisure was structured. Festivals, fairs, and rituals followed predictable patterns, weaving continuity into the social fabric. Over generations, these repeated practices fostered trust, cooperation, and a shared sense of identity, enabling towns to endure. Hygiene, health, and food security were also products of repetition. Daily cleaning of streets, maintenance of wells, and careful preparation of meals minimized the spread of disease, while regular inspections of livestock and storage areas ensured food stability. Although these routines might seem trivial, their cumulative impact was vital. A medieval town's resilience in the face of epidemics or famine depended largely on these repeated, methodical practices, performed faithfully by ordinary people day after day. Knowledge and skill were transmitted similarly. Apprentices learned through repeated tasks, hammering metal, kneading dough, or shaping pottery. Skills were reinforced by observation, imitation, and daily practice. In this way, towns became repositories of practical knowledge, cultural techniques, and social norms. The seemingly monotonous repetition of daily labor ensured that expertise, traditions, and community practices persisted across generations, forming a durable foundation for urban life. Crises, whether fires, conflicts, or disease outbreaks, revealed the importance of routine. When disaster struck, towns relied on the discipline and order established through repeated daily practices. Watch brigades followed established rotations, fire precautions were implemented systematically, and marketplaces continued functioning with careful supervision. Repetition provided predictability in unpredictable circumstances, allowing towns to recover and continue functioning despite challenges that might have overwhelmed less organized communities. Culturally, medieval towns were incubators of social cohesion and identity because of repetition. Religious observances, festivals, and public rituals reinforced shared values and collective memory. Even stories, songs, and local legends were repeated, retold, and practiced, embedding lessons about morality, survival, and community norms. Over time, this repetition created continuity, connecting generations and preserving knowledge, culture, and social cohesion across centuries. The legacy of medieval towns teaches a profound lesson. The endurance of civilization often rests not on dramatic events but on ordinary, disciplined action repeated faithfully over time. Commerce, craft, social order, and cultural transmission were all sustained through repetition. Daily routines, while mundane, had extraordinary consequences, shaping communities that could withstand environmental, social, and political challenges. As night falls and town fires burn low, streets quiet, shutters close, and townsfolk follow familiar evening rituals. In the rhythm of ordinary life, baking, repairing, recording, observing, history quietly unfolds. Medieval towns endure not because of singular heroic feats, but because countless ordinary people performed small, methodical actions with consistency and care. These acts, repeated faithfully over generations, created stability, preserved knowledge, and left a lasting imprint on the development of urban civilization. And so, when reflecting on medieval towns, one might ask how much of human progress relies on repetition, discipline, and the accumulation of ordinary acts over time. How many modern systems, structures, and communities owe their foundations to centuries of daily, repetitive labor, often unnoticed but utterly essential. In the quiet streets, bustling markets, and modest homes of a medieval town, the extraordinary power of the ordinary is revealed, reminding us that history is as much about faithful repetition as it is about dramatic events. Imagine waking in the stillness of a medieval monastery, Long before the first light of dawn, the stone walls are cold, the corridors silent, and the air carries the faint scent of incense and wood smoke. Here, life is governed not by external threats or markets, but by an internal rhythm of discipline, prayer, and repetitive labor. Monastic communities were organized around a strict schedule, where every action, from rising in the night to tending the gardens, served a purpose within a carefully orchestrated daily pattern. The day begins with the vigils, a period of prayer that occurs in the middle of the night. Monks rise from their simple straw-filled mattresses, often on little more than a few hours of sleep, and make their way to the chapel in silence. The repetition of ritual is central. Each prayer, chant, and recitation follows a fixed structure, repeated daily and across generations. Though the words and gestures may seem monotonous, the rhythm instills discipline, focus, and a sense of continuity that anchors life within the monastery. After vigils, monks return briefly to their cells before gathering for lauds, the morning prayer service. Meals are taken in silence, often consisting of bread, vegetables, and watered-down ale or broth. Eating is done slowly and deliberately, following established routines of blessing, serving, and cleaning. The repetition of these actions is not merely ceremonial. It fosters mindfulness, communal cohesion, and adherence to a lifestyle designed to regulate both body and spirit. Labor, too, is highly structured. Monks engage in tasks that sustain the monastery and its surrounding lands, tending gardens, copying manuscripts, brewing ale, baking bread, or repairing buildings. Each task is performed with precision and repeated systematically. A scribe might spend hours forming individual letters on parchment, following consistent techniques to ensure clarity and preservation. A gardener will water, prune, and harvest according to the rhythms of the seasons, repeating these tasks daily to ensure both the monastery's survival and the self-sufficiency of the community. Even mundane chores, such as sweeping floors, cleaning utensils, or maintaining tools, are approached with ritualistic regularity. Nothing is done haphazardly. Every action is deliberate and repeated according to a prescribed schedule. In this, monks cultivated patience, attentiveness, and a keen awareness that the ordinary acts of daily life are part of a larger spiritual and communal order. The monotony itself becomes a tool for focus, meditation, and discipline. Meals and work are punctuated by additional prayer times, terce, sext, and none, throughout the day. Each service follows a fixed pattern, creating a predictable framework around which labor, study, and rest revolve. This repetitive structure transforms the passage of time into a continuous, measured rhythm. Monks internalize the cycle, moving seamlessly between prayer, work, and contemplation. By the end of the day, the repetition has instilled both spiritual discipline and a highly functional daily routine that sustains the monastery physically, socially, and religiously. Learning and education are also embedded in repetition. Monks study religious texts, theology, philosophy, and sometimes astronomy or medicine. They read and copy texts repeatedly, memorizing prayers, chants, and passages. Apprentices and younger monks are instructed through the repetition of practical skills, preparing ink, illuminating manuscripts, or maintaining the scriptorium. These repetitive practices ensure both the survival of knowledge and the cohesion of monastic life, reinforcing the monastery as a center of culture, education, and literacy. Even leisure is structured. Periods of reading, contemplation, or walking in the cloisters are conducted according to the monastic timetable. Silence is maintained, allowing for reflection and meditation. The repeated rhythm of walking the cloisters, reading the same texts, and observing rituals cultivates inner discipline and reinforces the continuity of the monastic community. Through repetition, monks achieve a sense of purpose, structure, and endurance that supports both individual spirituality and communal stability. Health and sustenance are carefully regulated through routine. Diets are modest but consistent, sleep follows prescribed periods, and physical labor is balanced with periods of rest and prayer. The repetition of these practices promotes physical endurance, mental focus, and communal well-being. By adhering to such disciplined routines, monasteries could sustain themselves across decades, weathering political, environmental, and social challenges without collapsing. Even the architectural and environmental layout of monasteries reinforces repetition. Cloisters, gardens, chapels, and dormitories are arranged to facilitate movement along repeated paths, ensuring that every monk encounters the same rhythm of spaces, sounds, and activities daily. The physical repetition of movement mirrors the temporal repetition of prayer and labor, embedding routine into both body and environment. Yet questions emerge from this disciplined life. How did such repetition shape individual spirituality, creativity, and resilience? How did daily routines, performed faithfully over decades, allow monasteries to endure as centers of learning, agriculture, and social support? Monastic life shows that repetition, far from being boring, is a tool for stability, knowledge preservation, and the quiet shaping of culture. As evening approaches, vespers and compline mark the final prayers of the day. Candles flicker in stone holes, the scent of incense lingers, and the cloisters fall silent. Monks return to their cells, following the same paths they walked at dawn, preparing for rest before the cycle begins again. In these repeated, orderly actions, prayer, labor, study, and contemplation, monastic life continues, a quiet testament to the enduring power of routine, discipline, and human diligence. Monastic life in the Middle Ages, while outwardly serene and structured, was not without its trials. Monks faced internal and external challenges: illness, scarcity, political pressures, and occasionally conflict with the surrounding world. Yet the survival of the monastery depended less on singular heroic acts, and more on the faithful repetition of routines, prayer, labor, study, and communal discipline. These repeated practices became both shield and scaffolding, supporting individual resilience and the continuity of the community. One of the most persistent challenges was physical hardship. Monks often lived on limited rations, consumed simple diets of bread, vegetables, and legumes, and engaged in physically demanding labor such as tending gardens, chopping wood, or carrying water. Despite the monotony, repetition of these tasks provided predictability and ensured the monastery's survival. Daily routines of work and meal preparation, repeated with discipline, created structure and reduced the risk of disease or famine. Even minor lapses, a poorly maintained garden, spoiled food, or neglected water supply, could imperil the entire community. Illness, too, required careful management. Monasteries often functioned as centers of rudimentary healthcare, using herbs, simple surgical techniques, and careful observation to treat disease. Monks responsible for infirmaries relied on repetitive tasks, preparing poultices, boiling water, and monitoring patients' diets and conditions. These repetitive actions allowed for consistent care and the accumulation of knowledge over time. A simple, repeated observation, such as noting which herbs alleviated symptoms or which diets prevented fevers, became invaluable in sustaining lives and preserving institutional memory. The monastery also faced external pressures. Political shifts, taxation, or local conflicts occasionally threatened its independence or resources. In response, monks relied on meticulous record-keeping, negotiation, and adherence to legal and financial routines. Accounts of land, donations, and tithes were maintained with repetitive precision, ensuring transparency and continuity. The mundane task of documenting daily transactions, often through tedious copying and calculation, became a powerful tool for institutional resilience, protecting the monastery against economic or political instability. Social challenges within the community required equal attention. Monks were expected to live in harmony, balancing individual spiritual pursuits with communal obligations. Conflicts over labor, study responsibilities, or interpretation of rules were resolved through adherence to structured routines and guidance from senior members. Repeated rituals of council, communal labor, and shared prayer maintained discipline and cohesion. By practicing patience and following established procedures day after day, monasteries managed human conflict without destabilizing the community. Education and scholarship presented both opportunity and responsibility. Scribes, illuminators, and scholars engaged in repetitive work, copying texts, illustrating manuscripts, and studying theology. The repetition of these intellectual tasks ensured accuracy, preserved knowledge, and transmitted culture. Mistakes were minimized through repetition. A miscopied letter could alter meaning, demonstrating the importance of careful, repeated attention. Over decades, these cumulative efforts preserved religious, philosophical, and scientific texts that would later influence European culture for centuries. Even spirituality itself depended on repetition. Prayer, meditation, and ritual were not spontaneous. They were performed multiple times daily, every day of the year, for decades at a time. This repetition, far from being dull, created mental discipline and fostered a sense of continuity. Monks learned to focus, internalize teachings, and cultivate patience, resilience, and a capacity for reflection. Over time, the repetitive rhythms of spiritual practice shaped character. informed ethical decisions, and reinforced communal values. Crises sometimes emerged abruptly: a sudden illness, a failed harvest, or a visitor carrying political demands. Monks relied on established routines to respond. Gardens were managed for optimal yield, granaries were organized for equitable distribution, and tasks were rotated to ensure labor efficiency. Repetition allowed the monastery to act predictably under stress, enabling it to weather unexpected challenges with minimal disruption. Small, consistent actions, watering plants, counting rations, or tending fires, proved as critical to survival as prayers or negotiation with secular authorities. Monastic life also preserved intangible legacies through repeated ritual and study. Stories, prayers, chants, and philosophical lessons were transmitted with precision, shaping not only individual monks, but also the broader culture outside the monastery. Students and visitors observed repetitive work and worship, learning practical and spiritual lessons that would influence their own lives. Over generations, these repeated acts created an enduring intellectual and cultural infrastructure, allowing monasteries to serve as centers of knowledge long after the individuals who performed the work had passed. Yet questions remain: how did repeated routines shape not only the survival but the intellectual and spiritual influence of monasteries? How did ordinary, disciplined labor, physical, intellectual, and spiritual, create resilience in a world of uncertainty? Monastic life shows that repetition, structure, and attention to detail are not merely mundane. They are essential for endurance, learning, and cultural transmission. As the day ends, monks gather for vespers and compline, walking silent cloisters, lighting candles, and reciting prayers. The repetition of paths, prayers, and rituals mirrors the repetition of work and study. In these cycles, mundane yet profoundly disciplined, monastic communities persist, demonstrating how ordinary, repeated actions form the backbone of survival, spirituality, and legacy. Monastic life in the Middle Ages presents a striking example of how ordinary, repetitive actions can leave an extraordinary mark on history. While popular narratives often focus on kings, battles, and dramatic events, the enduring influence of monasteries derives largely from consistent, disciplined routines. Prayer, labor, study, and communal order, performed faithfully over decades and centuries. Through repetition, monasteries preserved culture, knowledge, and social stability in ways that shaped the course of European history. Economically, monasteries were self-sufficient centers of labor. Gardens, orchards, livestock, and workshops produced food, tools, and goods not only for the monastic community, but sometimes for nearby towns and markets. These outputs depended on repeated, meticulous work, tilling soil according to seasonal cycles, maintaining irrigation, tending animals, and baking bread. Over time, such routines ensured not just survival, but stability and productivity, providing a foundation for broader regional economies. Even small, repetitive tasks, sharpening tools, repairing roofs, or organizing granaries, contributed to the monastery's endurance and the well-being of surrounding communities. Monasteries also left a profound intellectual legacy. Scribes, illuminators, and scholars meticulously copied manuscripts, preserving religious texts, classical works, and scientific treatises. Each letter written, each page illustrated, each text studied was a repeated act that accumulated into a massive repository of knowledge. Without such faithful, methodical work, much of Europe's early literature, philosophy, and scientific thought might have been lost. Repetition, rather than sudden innovation, ensured the survival of cultural memory. Social cohesion within monasteries was similarly maintained through repetition. Structured schedules, hierarchical discipline, and communal rituals prevented conflict, promoted cooperation, and reinforced shared values. Monks learned responsibility, patience, and self-discipline through the repeated performance of work, prayer, and study. These social lessons, observed and occasionally imparted to visitors or apprentices, extended the influence of monastic life beyond the cloister walls, shaping broader cultural norms in medieval society. Spiritual life was inseparable from repetition. Daily cycles of prayer, meditation, and ritual instilled discipline, reflection, and moral focus. Over time, this consistent engagement with spiritual practice nurtured resilience and cultivated a sense of purpose among monks. By living a life of repeated devotion, they demonstrated how ordinary, disciplined routines could foster profound personal and communal transformation. The monastery became not only a center of faith, but also a model for disciplined living and moral reflection. Even during crises, famine, plague, or political instability, the repetition of routine provided stability. Gardens were tended methodically, granaries monitored daily, and work distributed according to established schedules. These persistent, ordinary actions allowed monasteries to endure when other institutions faltered. Repetition acted as a stabilizing force, enabling communities to survive challenges that might otherwise have disrupted daily life or obliterated knowledge and culture. Monastic contributions also extended to education and cultural transmission. Students, pilgrims, and visitors observed the repetition of prayer, labor, and study, internalizing lessons about discipline, patience, and resilience. Apprentices learned craft and scholarship through repeated tasks, ensuring the transmission of skills and knowledge across generations. By embedding repetition into both learning and practice, monasteries created enduring cultural legacies that shaped European intellectual life for centuries. Monastic architecture and environment further reinforced repetition. Cloisters, chapels, dormitories, gardens, and workshops were designed to facilitate regular movement and ritualized behavior. The physical repetition of paths mirrored temporal repetition of prayer and work, creating a tangible rhythm that supported daily life. These structures were not just functional, they embodied a philosophy that valued consistency, discipline, and order as essential tools for human endurance and spiritual growth. The legacy of monastic life challenges us to reconsider how history is shaped. It suggests that much of human endurance, intellectual preservation, and cultural transmission arises not from dramatic events, but from ordinary, methodical, and repeated actions. The daily routines of monks, mundane, disciplined, and unwavering, had a profound impact on European history, shaping agriculture, education, religion, and culture in ways that resonate centuries later. As night settles in the monastery, candles flicker along stone corridors, cloisters fall silent, and monks retreat to their cells for rest. Tomorrow, the cycle will begin anew: prayer, labor, study, and contemplation, repeated faithfully. In this rhythm lies the quiet, but extraordinary power of routine. Through repetition, monasteries endured, preserved knowledge, and influenced generations beyond their walls, proving that history is often built not on the dramatic, but on the faithful performance of ordinary acts. And so, one may reflect how much of the knowledge, culture, and resilience we inherit from the past depends on repetition, patience, and disciplined routine, rather than singular genius or heroic action. Monastic life demonstrates that the most lasting legacies may arise not from extraordinary events, but from the ordinary acts repeated faithfully across time. Imagine stepping onto a medieval road at dawn, the uneven cobblestones stretching through towns, forests, and fields, connecting distant villages and cities. Travel in the Middle Ages is far from effortless. There are no highways, no modern maps, and no reliable inns at every turn. Journeys are governed not by speed or comfort, but by careful planning, repetition, and attention to detail. Merchants, pilgrims, messengers, and nobles all rely on routines, preparing horses, checking supplies, studying routes, to navigate a world where uncertainty is constant. The day begins with preparation. Travelers check harnesses, mend carts, and inspect horses. Each item is examined repeatedly, because even a minor defect, a broken strap, a frayed rope, or a loose wheel, can turn a long journey into a disaster. Packing is systematic. Provisions are weighed and measured, food is preserved, and water containers are filled. Travelers carry not only necessities for themselves, but also tools for repair, maps or route notes, and sometimes goods for trade. The repeated practice of packing ensures that nothing essential is forgotten, and that supplies are sufficient for days or weeks on the road. Travel itself is slow and deliberate. Horses and carts are moved at a steady pace, not rushed, to preserve their energy. Travelers follow established rhythms, walking beside their animals at times, riding in shifts, and stopping for rest at predictable intervals. Even small, repeated acts, grooming horses, checking harnesses, and adjusting loads, prevent mishaps and ensure progress. This attention to routine is not glamorous, but it is essential for survival on roads that can be muddy, rocky, or obstructed by fallen trees. Pilgrims and merchants rely on known routes, often following markers such as mileposts, church steeples, or natural landmarks. Routes are repeated over generations, passed down by guides or local knowledge. Travelers frequently retrace the same roads, observing and recording patterns, the location of safe wells, reliable inns, or dangerous river crossings. These repeated journeys accumulate into practical knowledge that allows travelers to predict hazards, estimate travel times, and navigate safely, transforming uncertain landscapes into manageable spaces. Food and shelter are similarly structured. Inns and monasteries provide predictable, though often modest, accommodations. Meals are taken at consistent times, provisions rationed carefully, and travelers follow repetitive routines to clean and maintain their equipment. On long journeys, this repetition establishes a rhythm that supports endurance. Even the act of boiling water, repairing a shoe, or tending a horse becomes a repetitive task that safeguards survival. Trade and commerce depend on travel's repetitive routines. Merchants travel regularly to sell or acquire goods, adhering to schedules dictated by market days, fairs, or seasonal cycles. Every step of the journey, checking wares, negotiating with locals, recording transactions, is performed with care and consistency. These repeated practices ensure that goods move efficiently between regions, fostering economic stability despite the unpredictability of travel. Travel also exposes individuals to danger. Bandits, wild animals, and adverse weather are constant threats. Yet repetition mitigates risk. Scouts travel ahead, patrol routines are established at rest stops, and defensive habits, locking carts, securing valuables, or maintaining weapons, are performed daily. Even cautious, repetitive routines are vital, creating resilience against hazards that might otherwise derail a journey. Social interactions along the road are guided by repetition and convention. Travelers meet fellow pilgrims, merchants, or local authorities, exchanging greetings, advice, or assistance according to established norms. Inns, markets, and monasteries rely on repetitive social structures to maintain order. Rules for lodging, standards for trade, and routines for hospitality. These repeated behaviors, though ordinary, sustain social trust and allow travelers to navigate unfamiliar territories safely. The physical demands of travel require repetitive endurance. Long walks, horse riding, and handling heavy loads stress the body, but repeated training and careful pacing develop stamina. Travelers condition themselves over time, learning how to balance effort, rest, and sustenance. Small daily acts, stretching, adjusting gear, or tending minor injuries, accumulate into resilience that makes multi-day or multi-week journeys possible. Even observation is structured and repeated. Travelers note landmarks, river crossings, bridges, and potential hazards. These observations are recorded in notes, shared orally, or memorized. The repetition of traveling familiar paths reinforces memory and awareness, reducing the chance of mistakes on future journeys. Over time, repeated travel transforms uncertainty into knowledge, turning distant lands into predictable, navigable spaces. Yet questions remain: how did repeated, disciplined travel shape trade, cultural exchange, and communication across medieval Europe? How did ordinary routines, packing, pacing, observing, and maintaining equipment, allow people to connect distant regions despite limited infrastructure and constant risk? Medieval roads, though rough and often perilous, reveal that the endurance of travel relies on repetition, care, and methodical attention to detail. As night falls along the roadside, travelers make camp or enter inns, tending fires, feeding animals, and checking supplies. The repetitive tasks of survival, whether for a day or a week-long journey, continue quietly, ensuring that despite uncertainty, progress is made, goods are transported, and knowledge of the landscape accumulates. On these roads, the ordinary, methodical repetition of small actions shapes both immediate survival and the broader connections that underpin medieval society. Travel in the Middle Ages was rarely straightforward. Roads were rough, bridges were scarce, and dangers lurked both in the landscape and among human companions. Yet the persistence of travel trade and pilgrimage depended on repetition, meticulous preparation, careful pacing, and disciplined routines. Through repeated actions, travelers developed resilience, knowledge, and social networks that allowed them to navigate both hazards and opportunities. One constant hazard was the condition of the roads themselves. Dirt paths turned to mud with rain, rotted tracks caused accidents, and narrow bridges over rivers demanded careful crossing. Travelers relied on repeated practices inspecting wheels and harnesses, pacing their animals carefully, and adjusting loads at regular intervals. Even minor neglect, a loose strap or misaligned cart, could result in overturned goods, injured horses, or delays. By repeating checks and maintaining vigilance, travelers mitigated these risks, demonstrating that endurance on medieval roads depended as much on methodical care as on courage. Bandits and highwaymen were another ever-present threat. Travelers often moved in groups, a repeated strategy that increased safety through strength in numbers. Routine vigilance, scanning for suspicious figures, maintaining weapons ready, and following established patterns of alertness, allowed travelers to anticipate danger. Inns along major routes sometimes served as safe havens, where repeated patterns of trust, lodging arrangements, and watchfulness provided temporary security. Ordinary routines of observation and defense became essential tools for survival in an unpredictable world. Weather posed additional challenges. Sudden storms could flood rivers, wash away bridges, or render paths impassable. Travelers adapted by observing seasonal patterns, noting repeated occurrences of floods or storms, and timing departures accordingly. Supplies were rationed carefully, and travelers established routines for setting up tents, securing animals, or finding shelter. Repetition, experience, and attentive observation transformed the uncertainty of weather into manageable risk, allowing journeys to continue despite environmental challenges. Health was a constant concern. Long journeys exposed travelers to exhaustion, malnutrition, and disease. Regular routines of rest, pacing, and diet were vital. Meals were rationed carefully, water sources checked repeatedly, and physical exertion balanced with periods of rest. Travelers also monitored each other, using repeated observation to detect early signs of fatigue or illness. These seemingly ordinary actions preserved health and allowed journeys to continue over days, weeks, or even months. Social dynamics shaped the experience of travel. Groups of merchants, pilgrims, or messengers relied on repetitive patterns of cooperation and hierarchy. Leaders established routines for daily departure, rest breaks, and camp setup. Shared responsibilities, repeated day after day, maintained order and minimized conflict. Travelers also relied on repeated social interactions along the road, negotiating with local authorities, bartering with villagers, and observing local customs. These repeated routines established trust and facilitated smoother journeys across unfamiliar territories. Human stories emerge vividly in these routines. A merchant may rise before dawn each day to inspect goods, counting coins and weighing spices with precision, knowing that a minor miscalculation could ruin trade. A pilgrim may follow the same path, stopping at familiar landmarks, repeating prayers aloud or silently at the same shrines, finding comfort in the predictability amid uncertainty. A messenger may repeat the same pacing along a known route to ensure timely delivery, even in the face of storms or bandits. Each story reflects the extraordinary impact of repeated, disciplined action on survival and success. Trade, too, depended on repetition. Merchants traveled the same routes at predictable intervals, selling and acquiring goods according to market schedules. Repeated practices of recording transactions, inspecting goods, and negotiating prices ensured efficiency and trust. Even minor, repeated routines, measuring grain, checking coin authenticity, or verifying weights, safeguarded livelihoods. Without such disciplined repetition, commerce along medieval roads would have been chaotic and perilous. Crises tested both preparation and human ingenuity. When a bridge collapsed or a river flooded, travelers relied on familiar solutions, fording the river at known shallow points, building temporary rafts, or retracing familiar alternate paths. The repeated experience of encountering and solving obstacles built collective knowledge, reducing the likelihood of fatal errors in future journeys. Over time, the accumulation of repeated problem-solving created resilient networks of routes, practices, and social norms that supported medieval travel on a scale unseen in previous centuries. Yet questions linger. How did the repetition of careful preparation, observation, and daily routines shape the expansion of trade, cultural exchange, and information flow in medieval Europe? How did ordinary, disciplined acts performed by countless travelers allow distant regions to remain connected despite minimal infrastructure and constant danger? Medieval roads reveal that endurance, both of people and of the economic and cultural systems they supported, depended on repetition, vigilance, and methodical attention to detail. As night falls, travelers make camp along rivers or within the walls of inns, tending fires, feeding animals, and inspecting gear. The repetitive routines, checking harnesses, measuring provisions, pacing travel, and observing hazards, continue quietly. Through these ordinary, methodical actions, journeys succeed, goods are delivered, prayers are made, and knowledge accumulates. On medieval roads, the endurance of both people and society rests not on the dramatic, but on the faithful repetition of small, essential acts. Medieval travel, while often slow, arduous, and fraught with danger, left an enduring mark on European society. Roads, inns, and repeated journeys facilitated trade, cultural exchange, communication, and even political influence. Yet the lasting success of travel was not merely due to grand adventures or heroic exploits. It relied on the faithful repetition of ordinary, disciplined routines. Packing supplies, checking animals, observing landmarks, and maintaining schedules were as critical to medieval society as castles or armies. Economically, travel allowed goods to flow between distant towns, regions, and even nations. Merchants relied on repeated routes, predictable market schedules, and careful record-keeping. Each repeated act, measuring grain, inspecting cloth, weighing coins, created trust in trade networks, preventing disputes and enabling commerce to flourish. Over time, these routines built resilient economic systems that could survive fluctuations in supply, local conflicts, or environmental hazards. Ordinary repetition became the invisible mechanism sustaining medieval economies. Cultural exchange also depended on repeated journeys. Pilgrims, scholars, and travelers carried ideas, texts, religious practices, and techniques across regions. Repetition reinforced memory. Travelers memorized routes, customs, and landmarks, while monasteries, inns, and markets became nodes in a wider cultural network. Even small acts, such as retelling a story at an inn, copying a prayer, or trading knowledge about navigation, contributed cumulatively to the spread of ideas. The mundane acts of ordinary travelers, repeated day after day, season after season, shaped Europe's intellectual and cultural landscape. Political influence, too, flowed along these routes. Messengers and envoys relied on repetition. The same paths were taken, the same protocols observed, and information conveyed through disciplined, methodical routines. Reliable communication allowed monarchs, nobles, and local authorities to coordinate administration, collect taxes, and negotiate alliances. These repeated, ordinary practices underpinned governance across regions, demonstrating how structured travel enabled both economic and political cohesion. Safety and resilience were built through repetition. Travelers mitigated dangers, bandits, storms, and disease, through careful routines, traveling in groups, pacing journeys, maintaining weapons, and observing known hazards. Each repeated journey reinforced collective knowledge about the landscape, threats, and opportunities. Over generations, these patterns created a robust network of travel practices that allowed people to navigate Europe efficiently despite minimal infrastructure. The ordinary, disciplined repetition of preparation, observation, and vigilance was the foundation of survival. Human stories illustrate the power of repetition. A merchant might traverse the same route each season, refining packing techniques, learning shortcuts, and anticipating hazards. A pilgrim might visit the same shrines year after year, repeating prayers, observing rituals, and relying on familiar inns. A messenger might traverse hundreds of miles, relying on repeated pacing, rest, and observation to ensure messages are delivered accurately. These ordinary acts, repeated faithfully, produced extraordinary endurance and reliability. The physical and social infrastructure of medieval travel also relied on repetition. Inns, monasteries, bridges, and way stations were maintained according to predictable routines, enabling travelers to anticipate shelter, food, and guidance. Roads were improved or cleared through repeated communal effort, and local populations developed habits of assisting or regulating travelers. This cyclical interaction between travelers and the environment strengthened the stability of routes, enabling long-distance trade, pilgrimage, and communication to persist. Yet reflection raises questions. How much of medieval Europe's economic, cultural, and political cohesion relied not on extraordinary events, but on the repetition of ordinary routines by countless travelers? How many of the ideas, goods, and practices that shaped the continent spread because travelers maintained disciplined, faithful repetition across generations? Medieval roads and journeys demonstrate that endurance, connectivity, and progress often arise from ordinary acts performed consistently over time. As night falls along the medieval road, travelers settle at inns, feed their animals, inspect gear, and prepare for the next day. The repeated actions, packing, pacing, observing, maintaining, continue quietly, ensuring survival, commerce, and cultural exchange. Through these disciplined routines, distant lands remain connected, knowledge flows across regions, and society thrives. In the ordinary repetition of daily travel, we see the extraordinary power of human perseverance, preparation, and methodical action. The story of medieval travel reminds us that connectivity, commerce, and cultural exchange are not merely products of remarkable events, but of countless small, repeated, disciplined acts. Roads endure, knowledge spreads, and societies thrive because ordinary people perform the mundane, faithfully, carefully, and consistently, across centuries. Imagine a medieval village on the morning of a festival. Smoke rises from thatched roofs, merchants set up stalls in the market square, and children run barefoot along the cobblestones. Life in the Middle Ages was governed by repetition of work, prayer, and social rituals, but festivals introduced a distinct rhythm that both punctuated and reinforced daily routines. These celebrations, while seemingly extraordinary, relied heavily on repetition. Established customs, predictable sequences of events, and repeated preparation shaped both the experience of the festival and the cohesion of the community. Preparation for a festival often began weeks in advance. Bakers baked extra bread, brewers prepared ale, and butchers ensured adequate meat supplies. The repetition of these preparatory tasks reflected a broader pattern of medieval life: careful planning, methodical labor, and adherence to routines. Even decorating the market square, preparing stages for performances, or rehearsing songs and dances involved repeated practice. Each act, mundane in isolation, contributed cumulatively to the smooth execution of the festival, demonstrating how ordinary, repeated labor made communal celebration possible. Festivals were deeply tied to the agricultural and religious calendar. Harvest festivals, saints' days, and religious holidays occurred at the same time each year, creating a predictable pattern that villagers could anticipate. Markets aligned with these festivals, drawing merchants from nearby towns and even distant regions. The repetition of timing allowed communities to plan trade, coordinate labor, and preserve social cohesion. Villagers knew when to sow, when to harvest, and when to gather in the square, embedding festivals into the broader rhythm of life. Daily labor and festival preparation often overlapped. Artisans produced items for sale, cooks baked for both households and communal feasts, and farmers tended animals even as the village prepared for celebration. The repetition of work ensured survival, while the added layer of festival preparation allowed ordinary labor to gain new significance. Even mundane tasks, cleaning streets, repairing stalls, or checking weights and measures, were repeated in a heightened context, bridging the ordinary and the celebratory. Rituals and performances followed strict repetition. Religious processions, plays, dances, and music were performed according to established sequences. Villagers learned their roles through repeated practice. Priests rehearsed prayers, musicians repeated melodies, and actors followed scripts and choreography that had been performed for generations. The predictability of these rituals provided both comfort and structure, reinforcing communal identity and a shared sense of history. Through repetition, festivals became more than entertainment. They were instruments of social cohesion. Food and drink played a central role, and their preparation relied on repetition as well. Bakers, brewers, and cooks followed established recipes and schedules, ensuring sufficient quantities for the community. All was brewed with precise steps, bread baked according to traditional methods, and meat salted or smoked to preserve it for the festivities. These repeated culinary routines ensured that even large gatherings could be fed reliably, demonstrating how ordinary, methodical labor sustained extraordinary communal events. Market activity intensified during festivals. Merchants and traders relied on predictable patterns, setting up stalls at designated locations, weighing goods with familiar scales, and following established routines for bargaining. Shoppers also followed repetitive behaviors, checking measures, inspecting wares, and haggling according to customary sequences. The repeated structure of commerce allowed the market to function efficiently, even when the influx of visitors temporarily overwhelmed ordinary systems. Human stories within these festivals reveal the interplay of repetition and novelty. A child learning a festival song for the third or fourth year experiences the same melody, but with increasing mastery and understanding. A baker preparing extra loaves for the 5th annual harvest festival perfects technique through repetition. A merchant traveling the same trade route each year refines bargaining strategies and delivery timing. Each story illustrates that repetition does not diminish significance. It enhances skill, reinforces social bonds, and ensures continuity across generations. Even leisure activities followed predictable patterns. Games, competitions, and storytelling sessions were repeated annually, embedding tradition into communal memory. Villagers observed, participated, and sometimes inherited roles within these activities, ensuring that rituals and stories survived. Repetition provided stability within the celebration, allowing participants to anticipate, engage, and contribute meaningfully to the shared experience. Yet questions remain: how did the repeated patterns of festivals shape the social, economic, and cultural life of medieval communities? How did ordinary acts, baking, cleaning, trading, rehearsing, performed faithfully and repeatedly, create continuity, shared memory, and resilience. Medieval festivals remind us that even seemingly extraordinary events are often sustained by ordinary, disciplined repetition, grounding celebration in the rhythms of everyday life. As the sun rises fully, villagers gather, markets hum with activity, music fills the square, and the festival begins in earnest. Every repeated action, baker rolling dough, musician tuning strings, child learning steps of a dance, contributes to the vibrancy of the event. Through the ordinary repetition of preparation, practice, and participation, the medieval festival flourishes, demonstrating the quiet power of repeated effort in shaping communal life and memory. While medieval festivals were moments of joy, communal gathering, and cultural expression, they were far from seamless. The influx of visitors, the surge in trade, and the heightened activity created both logistical and social challenges. Yet, as with other aspects of medieval life, repetition, careful preparation, established routines, and adherence to custom enabled communities to navigate these challenges with resilience. One frequent challenge was the sheer volume of people. Villages and towns swelled as pilgrims, traders, and neighboring villagers arrived. Streets and marketplaces became crowded, increasing the risk of accidents, disputes, or theft. Local authorities and festival organizers relied on repeated routines, assigning stalls according to fixed patterns, monitoring crowd movement, and implementing customary rules for behavior. By following these predictable patterns, towns maintained order and minimized conflict despite the temporary chaos. Food and drink, essential to festival life, also posed logistical difficulties. Large gatherings required vast amounts of bread and meat, all prepared in advance. Bakers and cooks relied on repeated routines perfected over years, measuring ingredients, timing ovens, and brewing beer with consistent techniques. Even minor deviations, overcooked loaves, undersalted meat, or spilt ale, could disrupt the rhythm of the festival. The faithful repetition of culinary labor ensured that sustenance was available, supporting both comfort and social cohesion. Disputes were inevitable. Merchants argued over prices, neighbors quarreled over space, and occasional drunkenness led to scuffles. Yet repetition mitigated these conflicts. Established rules, customary procedures, and rituals of mediation created predictable ways to resolve disputes. Town officials and guild members, following repeated processes, restored order quickly, demonstrating that routine, even in social governance, was a stabilizing force. Over time, repeated exposure to festivals trained both authorities and participants to anticipate and manage conflicts efficiently. Human stories reveal how repetition shaped experience and memory. A blacksmith attending the annual fair might rehearse selling techniques he has refined for years, learning to measure coins accurately, weigh iron, and predict customer behavior. A child participating in festival dances may practice the same steps each year, gradually mastering rhythm and movement. A traveling musician repeats melodies, learning subtle variations in tempo or ornamentation from previous years. These repeated actions create expertise, confidence, and continuity, showing how the ordinary underpins even the most celebratory events. Religious rituals within festivals also relied heavily on repetition. Processions, prayers, and ceremonial observances followed strict patterns that had been performed for generations. Monks, priests, and lay participants repeated chants, gestures, and routes with precision, reinforcing communal identity and spiritual focus. The repetition of ritual created stability amid the excitement of celebration, ensuring that even large, disorderly gatherings maintained a sense of purpose and reverence. Market activities presented both opportunity and strain. Merchants faced repeated challenges, ensuring that wares were correctly priced, guarding against fraud, and navigating competition. Buyers, too, relied on habitual behaviors, checking weights, haggling according to familiar sequences, and repeatedly assessing quality. This repetition, embedded in everyday commercial practice, allowed markets to function efficiently even under the temporary pressures of festival crowds. Weather could disrupt festivals unpredictably. Rain, wind, or heat required quick adaptation. Yet towns relied on repetitive practices, securing stalls, covering goods, and redirecting crowds, that had been honed over successive festivals. These repeated actions mitigated disruption and allowed celebrations to continue, showing how accumulated experience and disciplined routine helped communities cope with environmental uncertainty. Even leisure and entertainment were governed by repetition. Games, competitions, storytelling, and music followed established patterns. Participants and spectators learned sequences, rules, and expectations over time, Repeated observation and participation enhanced skill, preserved tradition, and fostered communal memory. Festivals became living archives of local culture, sustained by faithful repetition of performance and participation. Yet reflection prompts questions. How did the ordinary, repeated preparation of festivals allow communities to flourish socially, economically, and culturally despite challenges? How did repetition in labor, ritual, and governance transform potential chaos into cohesion, memory, and enduring tradition? Medieval festivals reveal that even extraordinary events rely on disciplined repetition to succeed and endure. As the day concludes, market stalls close, dancers leave the square, and musicians finish the final notes of their songs. Streets are cleaned, animals fed, and goods stored carefully, following routines repeated throughout the day. These ordinary, methodical acts ensure that the festival concludes smoothly, preserving both resources and communal memory. Through repetition, challenges are managed, disputes resolved, and celebration transformed into continuity, a rhythm that sustains medieval life beyond the moment of festivity. Medieval festivals, while outwardly joyful and celebratory, played a far deeper role in the life of communities. They were not merely moments of diversion, they were mechanisms for cultural continuity, social cohesion, and economic vitality. At the heart of their enduring impact lay repetition, repeated preparation, ritual, labor, and participation, performed faithfully year after year, generation after generation. Through this repetition, ordinary acts created extraordinary outcomes. Economically, festivals strengthened both local and regional trade. Merchants traveled predictable routes, bringing goods that aligned with market cycles and festival schedules. Bakers, brewers, and artisans prepared supplies according to repeated routines, ensuring that food, drink, and crafts were available in sufficient quantities. Every act, measuring ingredients, counting coins, setting up stalls, was performed carefully and repeatedly, safeguarding both livelihood and communal stability. The mundane labor behind the celebration was essential to its success, demonstrating how ordinary work underpinned extraordinary social events. Social cohesion relied heavily on predictable structures. Festivals created spaces where hierarchy, rules, and customs were respected. Villagers, travelers, and visiting merchants observed established routines. Processions followed fixed routes, competitions adhered to standard rules, and disputes were resolved according to customary procedures. This repeated adherence to norms reinforced communal identity and mutual trust. Ordinary, disciplined behaviors prevented chaos, allowing large gatherings to function smoothly and fostering a shared sense of belonging across social strata. Cultural transmission depended on repetition as well. Stories, songs, dances, and rituals were performed annually, embedding traditions in memory and practice. Children learned through repetition, gradually mastering dances, songs, and crafts, while adults refined skills and techniques each year. Over decades, these repeated practices ensured that cultural knowledge survived, providing continuity in a world often threatened by disease, war, and social upheaval. Festivals became repositories of collective memory, shaped by repetition and sustained by ordinary acts. Religious rituals reinforced both spiritual and communal life. Processions, prayers and blessings, performed in consistent patterns, linked the community to larger spiritual and agricultural cycles. By repeating sacred acts, villagers experienced continuity and reassurance, finding meaning in shared rhythm. Even when external circumstances were uncertain, the repeated rituals of festivals anchored communities in faith, habit, and tradition. Human stories illuminate how repetition shaped experience. A merchant preparing for the annual fair over decades learns efficiency, builds trust, and anticipates market behavior. A musician performing the same melodies year after year refines technique, develops nuance, and passes knowledge to apprentices. A child participating in festival dances each year experiences mastery and social integration, connecting with community memory and identity. Across all these stories, repetition transforms ordinary effort into enduring impact. Festivals also served as a bridge between the ordinary and the extraordinary. While daily life was governed by repetitive labor, prayer, and routines, festivals elevated these ordinary acts into communal celebration. Preparation, labor, and practice, ordinary in themselves, culminated in vibrant expression, demonstrating how repetition underpins creativity, skill, and social connection. The extraordinary emerges not from randomness, but from disciplined, repeated effort over time. Yet reflection prompts thought: how much of the cultural richness, social cohesion, and collective memory of medieval communities depended on repetition? the faithful performance of ordinary acts that structured extraordinary moments. Medieval festivals remind us that continuity, culture, and community are not solely created in dramatic events, but through the quiet, disciplined repetition of labor, ritual, and participation. As twilight falls over the village, stalls are dismantled, fires extinguished, and travelers depart. Music fades, streets empty, and the community returns to daily routines. Labor in fields, preparation of meals, maintenance of homes, all repeated faithfully. The cycle of ordinary life resumes, yet the festival leaves its marked, skills refined, traditions reinforced, and communal bonds strengthened. Through repetition, both ordinary labor and extraordinary celebration endure, shaping culture, memory, and society for generations to come. Medieval festivals, in their rhythm and repetition, teach a lasting lesson. History, culture, and community often flourish, not through singular dramatic events, but through ordinary acts repeated faithfully across time. In every loaf baked, song performed, and dance rehearsed, continuity is preserved and the ordinary becomes extraordinary.